They thought they had me backed into a corner. My own son and his entitled wife slid a legal document across my dining table, their eyes gleaming with the anticipation of stealing everything I had built. They thought my silence was surrender. They thought a 69-year-old man was an easy mark. They had no idea they were walking straight into a trap that would leave them bankrupt, publicly humiliated, and facing federal charges. Before I tell you how I dismantled their lives piece by piece, let me know what city you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach a harsh lesson to someone who mistreated you. My name is Quincy Jenkins. I am 69 years old, a widower, and a man who spent 40 years turning a single delivery truck into a logistics empire across the South. I sold that company 5 years ago and retired to a quiet life in an upscale suburb outside Atlanta. I thought I had earned my peace after losing my beloved wife, Lorraine. I was wrong. That peace shattered on a Sunday evening. The heavy cream-colored envelope hit my mahogany dining table with a sharp slap. Inside was a general power of attorney document. My daughter-in-law, Heather, sat across from me sipping my expensive bourbon with a smirk playing on her lips. She did not even try to hide her contempt. "You really should sign it, Quincy," she said, her voice dripping with that fake Southern sweetness she used whenever she wanted to manipulate a situation. "We cannot have you mismanaging things at your age." My son, Kendrick, cleared his throat. He wore a designer suit he could not afford and a watch that probably cost more than my first delivery truck. He leaned forward, trying to project the image of a concerned son taking the reins of the family. "Dad, you had that blood pressure spike last month. The doctor said you need to avoid stress. Managing all these accounts, the house, the bills, it is just too much for you right now. Let me take the wheel." I looked at him calmly. A mild hypertension reading. That was his grand excuse to strip me of my financial autonomy. I had built a multi-million-dollar company from dirt and sweat, negotiating with union bosses and corporate sharks, and my own flesh and blood was using a slightly elevated blood pressure reading to declare me unfit. Heather chimed in, swirling the amber liquid in her crystal glass. "Kendrick is right. We saw your bank statements from last quarter. Those massive donations to that community church downtown. Really, Quincy. Throwing away good money to a rundown parish in that neighborhood. It borders on senility. We need to protect your assets before you give them all away to people who just want handouts." Her words were sharp, loaded with an entitlement and a subtle prejudice that made my blood boil. She sat in my house drinking my liquor, criticizing my decision to give back to the very black community that supported me and Lorraine when we had absolutely nothing. To Heather, my generosity was proof of a failing mind. To me, her greed was proof of a rotten soul. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my charitable giving. I simply watched them. Kendrick shifted uncomfortably under my cold gaze, tapping his fingers against the table. "Dad, I am a financial analyst. I know markets. I know wealth management. I can take your portfolio and double it. You just need to step back and let me handle the heavy lifting. I know you and Mom worked hard, but the world moves fast now. You do not want to become a victim of your own declining faculties." He said it with such rehearsed conviction. He wanted me to believe I was a fragile, deteriorating old man. He wanted me to doubt my own mind. They had coordinated this ambush perfectly. Dinner, a few drinks, fake concern, and then the legal paperwork designed to strip me of my life savings. They expected me to argue. They expected the stubborn old man routine. They were ready for a fight. I looked down at the document. The legal jargon was clear. It granted Kendrick full, unrestricted access to my financial accounts, real estate decisions, and investment portfolios. It was a blank check to my entire existence. I slowly reached into the inner pocket of my tailored vest and pulled out my reading glasses. I put them on and stared at the paper. The silence in the dining room grew thick and heavy. I could hear the antique grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. I could hear Heather breathing, her eyes locked hungrily on my hands. I let the silence stretch. I let them sweat. For 40 years I made business decisions that broke men twice my size. Now I was looking at a boy who thought he had outsmarted the man who taught him how to walk. Kendrick wiped a small bead of sweat from his forehead. "Dad, it is for your own good. We just want to make sure you are taken care of in your twilight years." I took a deep breath, letting my shoulders slump slightly. I forced a slight tremor into my hands. It was a subtle, calculated performance. "You know, Kendrick," I said, making my voice sound older, softer, and incredibly tired. "Maybe you are right. Managing everything has been a bit overwhelming lately. My memory is not exactly what it used to be. The relief that washed over Kendrick's face was instantaneous and pathetic. His posture relaxed immediately. A wide, victorious smile broke across his face. Heather leaned back in her chair, her smirk widening into a triumphant grin. She crossed her arms, looking around my luxurious dining room as if she was already planning how to redecorate it. I picked up the gold-plated fountain pen lying next to the document. I held it for a moment, letting the cool metal warm in my grip. I looked directly at Kendrick. "You promise you will handle things responsibly, son?" I asked, injecting just the right amount of vulnerability into my tone. "I promise, Dad. You will not have to worry about a single thing ever again." He said it with the smooth confidence of a seasoned con artist. I lowered the pen to the paper. I signed my name with a deliberate, slow stroke. Quincy Jenkins. I slid the document across the mahogany table. Kendrick practically snatched it from the wood. His hands were shaking not from nervousness but from pure, unadulterated greed. He looked at the signature, then folded the paper quickly and shoved it into his leather briefcase as if afraid I might change my mind and snatch it back. "Thank you, Dad. You made the right choice," he said, standing up quickly from his chair. "We should get going. I will take this to the bank first thing tomorrow morning." Heather stood up, smoothing the front of her expensive dress. She walked over and gave me a patronizing pat on the shoulder. "Get some rest, Quincy. You look exhausted." They practically ran out the door, eager to celebrate their newly acquired wealth. I listened to the heavy oak door close shut behind them. I heard the engine of Kendrick's car start and fade away down the long suburban driveway. I sat alone in the quiet dining room. I took off my reading glasses and placed them neatly on the table. The fake tremor in my hands vanished instantly. The tired, slumped posture disappeared. I sat up straight, a cold, hard smile forming on my lips. They thought they had won. They thought they had just secured the keys to my entire kingdom and stripped me of my power. What Kendrick did not know, and what he was too arrogant and eager to check, was the specific routing and account number listed on that customized document. I did not sign over my main estate. I did not sign over my primary investment portfolios. I signed over a secondary decoy account. It was an account I had set up years ago holding exactly $200,000. It was a lot of money to an ordinary person, but it was pocket change compared to my actual net worth. It was the bait, and my greedy, foolish son had just swallowed it whole. The trap was set, and the hunt had officially begun. The sprawling silence of my 8,000 square foot estate was usually a profound comfort to me. Tonight it felt like a grand stage waiting for the next cruel act to unfold. Kendrick and Heather had not gone far after their hasty and triumphant departure from my dining room. They currently resided in the fully furnished East Wing guest suite of my home. It was an arrangement I had agreed to 6 months ago under the guise of family bonding and keeping an eye on my health. In reality, I knew it was just another way for my son to dodge his mounting living expenses and maintain a lifestyle he simply could not afford. I decided to pour myself a glass of cold water from the kitchen before retiring to my study for the evening. As I walked down the long, carpeted hallway connecting the main house to their private wing, a sharp sound pierced the quiet night. The unmistakable clink of fine crystal glasses. A celebration. They were toasting to their perceived victory over a foolish old man. I stopped dead in my tracks. The heavy oak door to their suite was slightly ajar, casting a thin sliver of warm yellow light across the dark corridor. I stepped closer, my leather slippers making absolutely no sound on the thick Persian rug. Heather's voice drifted through the crack in the door. It was entirely stripped of the fake southern charm she had used in my presence just an hour prior. Her tone was sharp, laced with an arrogant superiority that turned my stomach. "I cannot believe the old man just handed it over to us so easily," she laughed, the sound sharp and grating in the quiet house. "Did you see his face, Kendrick? The shaking hands. He is practically halfway to the grave already. He made it too easy. I almost felt bad for him, but then I remembered how stubborn he usually is." Kendrick chuckled, a weak and compliant sound that disgusted me far more than her blatant insults. "I told you it would work out perfectly. He trusts me. He always has. He thinks I am going to double his investments and secure his legacy for the next generation. He really believes I am doing this out of the goodness of my heart." Then Heather crossed a boundary that could never be uncrossed. She brought up my late wife. "Well, it is about time someone with actual taste and vision took control of this massive estate," Heather said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Once we have full access to the primary accounts and move him out, the first thing I am doing is gutting this hideous main house, that awful floral wallpaper in the sitting room, Those outdated velvet couches. It reeks of your mother. Or Lorraine had absolutely zero class. It looks like a cheap thrift store exploded in here. I cannot wait to hire a modern designer, tear down these walls, and erase every single trace of her from this property. My chest tightened until it was physically hard to breathe. Lorraine had designed every single inch of this home with immense love and pride. She grew up with absolutely nothing, just like I did, and this house was her ultimate masterpiece, a testament to everything we had survived and conquered. Hearing this entitled woman who had never built a single thing in her entire life spit on my dead wife's legacy was a violation I could barely comprehend. But Heather was not finished outlining her grand vision. We need to figure out the next step immediately. She continued, the ice clinking loudly in her glass as she took another sip of my expensive liquor. Having the financial power of attorney is great, but he is still physically living in the house. He is a massive liability wandering around these halls. What if he wakes up one day, realizes what we are doing, and decides to revoke the paperwork? We need him completely out of the picture before he can cause any legal trouble. What are you suggesting? Kendrick asked, his voice hesitant, but entirely willing to be led into darkness. A facility, Heather stated flatly without a single ounce of hesitation. A state facility. We use the power of attorney to authorize a forced medical transfer. We tell the doctors his mental decline makes him a severe danger to himself. We put him in one of those assisted living centers downtown, the cheap ones run by the state, not the private luxury ones that drain the inheritance. That way we preserve the estate capital for ourselves, sell this massive house, and finally live the way we truly deserve without him breathing down our necks. The air in my lungs turned to absolute frost. A state facility. They did not just want to steal my wealth and live off the fruits of my 40 years of hard labor. They wanted to strip away my basic freedom, erase my human dignity, and lock me away in a sterile, depressing room to rot while they financed a life of luxury on my dime. My own son. The boy I had carried on my shoulders. The young man whose expensive college tuition I paid in full without a second thought was sitting there in complete silence. He was tacitly agreeing to throw his father away like a piece of useless garbage. For a fleeting second, a profound and agonizing sorrow washed over me. It was the devastating pain of a father realizing his child is fundamentally broken, devoid of any real loyalty, empathy, or love. I remembered teaching him how to ride a bike, comforting him when he scraped his knee, and working 18-hour shifts just to make sure he never had to know the poverty I grew up in. All of those memories turned to ash in my mouth. But that brief moment of grief was immediately incinerated by a white-hot absolute rage. I did not gasp. I did not push the door open and storm into the room to confront them. Screaming, crying, and yelling were tactics for the weak and the powerless. I was not powerless. I reached into the pocket of my tailored slacks and pulled out my smartphone. My thumb moved with steady, absolute precision. I opened the voice memo application and hit the bright red record button. I held the device near the crack in the door, capturing every toxic word, every arrogant laugh, and every single detail of their malicious conspiracy. "I will start researching places tomorrow morning," Kendrick finally said, sealing his own permanent fate with those treacherous words. "We can probably get a doctor to sign off on a cognitive decline evaluation by the end of the month. We will tell him it is just for a routine checkup. Once the doctor signs the paper, we have full legal authority to move him." Perfect, Heather purred, her voice thick with greed and satisfaction. "To the future, darling." Another loud clink of crystal glasses echoed into the hallway. The audio waveform on my smartphone screen spiked, etching their treachery into digital stone. I stood perfectly still, controlling my breathing, making sure not to make a single sound that might alert them to my presence. I let the recording run for another 2 full minutes, gathering every drop of their poisonous dialogue as they discussed the cars they would buy and the vacations they would take once they liquidated my assets. This was not just a private conversation between a husband and wife, it was a criminal confession. It was the first undeniable piece of evidence in a dossier that would eventually bury them both. I firmly pressed the stop button and immediately saved the file to a secure cloud server. The evidence was safe locked away where they could never delete it, even if they somehow got their hands on my phone. I quietly stepped back from the door, retreating into the deep shadows of the long hallway. The grand house was completely silent again, save for the heavy rhythmic thumping of my own heart in my chest. I walked back to my private study and sat behind my heavy mahogany desk. I turned on the small brass desk lamp and looked at the framed photograph of Lorraine resting near my computer monitor. Her warm smile, her bright and loving eyes looking back at me. I reached out and touched the cool glass gently. I made a silent, unbreakable vow in the dark room. I would not let them tarnish her beautiful memory. I would not let them take a single dime of the legacy we had sacrificed our entire lives to build together. There would be no fatherly forgiveness. There would be no second chances, no tearful family interventions, and no therapeutic conversations. Blood or not, Kendrick had chosen to become a parasite, and Heather was the toxic disease feeding his worst impulses. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of deception with a man who had survived the most ruthless corporate battles in the entire South. They thought they were the apex predators in this scenario, hunting a weak and wounded animal. They had absolutely no idea they were already bleeding out from a wound they could not even see. I opened my laptop, the screen illuminating my cold expression in the dim room, and began drafting an urgent email to my attorney. The game had officially begun, and I intended to win. It had been exactly 48 hours since Kendrick practically snatched the power of attorney document off my dining room table. I was sitting in my study going over some old operational logs from my transport days when the sharp, crisp notification chime of my smartphone broke the morning silence. I picked up the device and looked at the brightly lit screen. It was an automated alert from the secondary bank account, the decoy account I had signed over to my son. The message was brief, but it spoke volumes about the sheer lack of self-control I was dealing with. A wire transfer had just been initiated and successfully cleared. $50,000 was gone, just like that. They did not wait a week. They did not even wait a full business cycle to establish a baseline of trust. The ink on the legal paperwork was barely dry, and they were already treating my money like a winning lottery ticket. I set the phone down on the heavy wooden desk, feeling a grim satisfaction settling deep in my chest. A smart thief takes small amounts over a long period to avoid detection. A greedy, desperate fool grabs as much as he can carry the second the vault is open. Kendrick was an absolute fool. He had no discipline, no strategic patience, and no respect for the wealth I had accumulated. Less than an hour later, the deep, throaty rumble of a high-performance engine echoed up my long driveway. I walked over to the large bay window in the living room and pulled back the sheer curtain just enough to get a clear view of the front courtyard. A brand-new top-of-the-line luxury SUV gleaming in a pristine coat of metallic black paint rolled to a smooth stop right in front of the main portico. It was the kind of vehicle that screamed new money and terrible financial decisions. The driver's side door opened, and Kendrick stepped out wearing a pair of dark designer sunglasses and a smile so wide it looked painful. The passenger door swung open immediately after, and Heather emerged. She looked like a woman who had just conquered a small country. She ran her hands over the sleek leather interior, laughing loudly, her voice carrying clear across the manicured lawn. I opened the heavy front door and stepped out onto the porch. Heather saw me first. She tossed her blonde hair over her shoulder and leaned against the polished hood of the massive vehicle, crossing her arms with a look of supreme arrogance. "Look who is awake!" she called out, her tone dripping with mock affection and underlying mockery. "Come check out the new addition to the family, Quincy. Is it not absolutely gorgeous?" I walked slowly down the brick steps, maintaining an expression of mild confusion. "That is quite a machine," I said, keeping my voice perfectly neutral. "Did you two win a sweepstakes that I am unaware of?" Kendrick walked around the front of the SUV and clapped a heavy hand on my shoulder, projecting the false confidence of a successful Wall Street broker. "Dad, I told you I was going to handle your wealth management properly. You have to spend money to make money. This is not just a vehicle. It is a strategic corporate asset. I moved $50,000 from your account this morning into a specialized high-yield mobility investment fund. This SUV is a tax write-off, a depreciating asset designed to offset capital gains in the upcoming fiscal quarter. It is complex financial restructuring. You do not need to worry about the logistics. I have everything completely under control." He spoke quickly, throwing out financial buzzwords like confetti, hoping to blind an old man with technical jargon. It was the most pathetic, transparent lie I had ever heard in my life. He had stolen $50,000 to buy his demanding wife a luxury toy, and he was trying to package it as a brilliant market strategy. I looked at the shiny black exterior of the SUV. I looked at Heather, who was practically vibrating with smug satisfaction, clearly thrilled that she was driving a vehicle paid for by the very man she planned to lock away in a state facility. Then I looked at Kendrick. I let my eyes widen slightly, adopting the persona of a proud, slightly naive father who was deeply impressed by his son's corporate acumen. A high-yield mobility investment fund. I repeated, nodding slowly as if the concept had just clicked in my aging brain. Well, Kendrick, I have to admit, I never would have thought of something like that. In my day, an investment was buying another warehouse or adding 3 more freight trucks to the fleet. The financial world really has evolved beyond my understanding. Kendrick puffed out his chest, his ego inflating to massive proportions. Exactly, Dad. The market is completely different now. You cannot rely on old-school tactics. You need aggressive modern strategies to protect your capital. That is why you signed that paperwork. You made the right call trusting me to modernize your portfolio. I walked around the vehicle, running my hand along the expensive chrome trim. Heather watched me closely, a cruel amusement dancing in her eyes. It really is a beautiful piece of machinery, I said softly, ensuring my voice sounded appropriately subdued. I am glad you two are looking out for my finances. It takes a heavy burden off my mind to know my legacy is in such capable modern hands. Kendrick beamed, completely oblivious to the trap closing around him. We are going to take it for a scenic drive down the coast to break in the engine, he announced, casually jingling the heavy set of smart keys in his hand. We will probably grab a nice dinner while we are out. Do not wait up for us, Dad. Make sure you take your blood pressure medication. They climbed into the pristine leather seats, the heavy doors shutting with a solid, expensive thud. Kendrick revved the powerful engine, sending a deep growl echoing off the brick facade of my home. Heather waved at me from the passenger window, a condescending flutter of her fingers before Kendrick threw the vehicle into drive and sped off down the driveway, leaving a faint cloud of dust in their wake. I stood on the porch and watched them disappear down the suburban street. My act instantly dropped. The mild confusion and fatherly pride vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating intensity. Kendrick thought he was a genius. He thought he had successfully outsmarted a wealthy old man. He had no idea that his $50,000 theft was exactly what I needed him to do. The money was a small price to pay to establish a documented pattern of financial abuse. I turned around and walked briskly back into the house. I did not waste a single second. I bypassed my study and headed straight for the garage. I walked past the empty space where Kendrick's new toy should have been parked and walked over to my classic, meticulously maintained sedan. It was not flashy. It was not a high-yield mobility asset. It was reliable, sturdy, and unassuming, exactly the way I preferred to operate. I climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and backed out of the garage with steady precision. As I navigated the quiet, tree-lined streets of my neighborhood and merged onto the highway heading toward the city center, my mind was running through the next phase of the operation. The bait had been taken, and the first piece of undeniable financial fraud had been committed. Now it was time to lock the doors and reinforce the walls. I drove straight downtown, pulling into the underground parking structure of a towering glass and steel high-rise. I rode the private elevator up to the top floor, stepping out into the sleek, quiet reception area of Hayes & Associates. The receptionist recognized me immediately and waved me right through the heavy glass doors. I walked straight into the corner office of my attorney, Bradley Hayes. It was time to activate the second layer of defense. The elevator doors slid open and I walked straight into Bradley Hayes' corner office without bothering to knock. Bradley was not just my attorney. He was my corporate enforcer, the man who had navigated the legal minefields of my logistics empire for over 2 decades. He was a shark in a tailored suit, and right now I needed his teeth. He sat behind his massive oak desk, a cup of black coffee steaming next to a legal pad. I did not exchange pleasantries. I reached into my leather briefcase, pulled out the thick manila folder the private investigator had hand-delivered to me that morning, and tossed it onto the polished wood. It hit the oak surface with a heavy, satisfying thud. Bradley did not flinch. He picked up the folder, adjusted his silver-framed glasses, and flipped it open. I sat down in the leather chair opposite him, crossing my legs, my face completely devoid of emotion. The room was silent except for the crisp rustle of thick paper as Bradley scanned the initial summary page. I had asked the investigator to dig into every single corner of my son's financial life, to pull up the floorboards and show me the rot underneath. The silence in the room was absolute heavy, with the anticipation of a devastating revelation. I watched Bradley read, waiting for the inevitable confirmation of my worst suspicions. Bradley leaned back in his chair, exhaling a long, slow breath. The investigator was incredibly thorough, Quincy Bradley began, his voice dropping an octave to that serious clinical tone he used when delivering bad news. You knew your son was living beyond his means, but the reality is much darker than a few unpaid credit cards or an expensive mortgage. He turned the page, tracing a line of data with his expensive pen. Kendrick is drowning in a financial abyss. The total verified debt sits at a staggering $600,000. I kept my face entirely still, betraying absolutely no shock. Go on, I instructed, my voice flat and commanding. Bradley began to list the atrocities. First, there was the cryptocurrency market. Kendrick thought he was a financial genius, but he leveraged his own assets and took out massive margin loans to chase digital coins that crashed to zero. That accounts for roughly $200,000 in immediate unrecoverable losses. He paused, looking me directly in the eye. But it gets much worse. When the banks cut off his credit, Kendrick turned to alternative lenders. He borrowed heavily from underground loan sharks operating out of the east side of the city. Men who do not send polite collection letters. Men who break legs and burn down houses when they are not paid on time. He owes them almost $300,000, and the interest is compounding weekly. I felt a surge of disgust. My son, a man raised with every advantage, was borrowing money from violent street thugs, but Bradley was not finished. The final nail in the coffin is his current employment, Bradley continued, tapping the last page of the report. The financial firm he works for is conducting an internal audit. Kendrick has been systematically embezzling corporate funds to cover his crypto losses and make the minimum payments to the loan sharks. He has been moving client money around, trying to plug the holes in a sinking ship. The corporate auditors are closing in. It is only a matter of days before they find the missing capital. When they do, he will be immediately terminated and handed over to federal authorities for criminal prosecution. Embezzlement, wire fraud, and grand larceny. He is staring down the barrel of a massive federal prison sentence. The naked, ugly truth was laid bare on that oak desk. The entire performance at my dining room table had absolutely nothing to do with my blood pressure, my age, or my legacy. Kendrick did not ask to manage my wealth out of some misguided sense of filial duty or concern for his aging father. He did not care about my health, my community donations, or my well-being. He was a desperate, cornered rat trying to chew his way out of a trap he had set for himself. He needed my money to literally save his own life from the criminal underworld and to buy his way out of a federal prison sentence. The $50,000 he had stolen this morning for that luxury SUV was a pathetic, impulsive distraction. It was Heather demanding her cut of the loot while Kendrick was secretly sweating bullets over the massive debts hanging over his head. He was playing the part of a successful wealth manager for his entitled wife while simultaneously running for his life from the mob. The sheer audacity of his deception was almost impressive, if it were not so utterly repulsive. I sat in the leather chair, letting the magnitude of his betrayal wash over me. He was willing to strip me of my life savings, throw me into a depressing state-run facility, and destroy everything I had built with Lorraine, all to cover up his own reckless, illegal failures. He saw my 40 years of hard labor as his personal get-out-of-jail-free card. He viewed my generosity to my community as a waste because he believed every single dollar I owned rightfully belonged to his survival fund. My own flesh and blood had reduced me to a mere asset to be liquidated for his salvation. A cold, absolute resolve hardened my heart into solid steel. Any lingering trace of paternal hesitation evaporated instantly. I was no longer dealing with a misguided son who needed a strict lesson in financial responsibility. I was dealing with a desperate criminal who was actively plotting my total destruction. The gloves were officially coming off. I would not just stop him. I would let him walk all the way to the edge of the cliff before I personally pushed him over. I wanted him to feel the exact moment his false empire crumbled into dust. Bradley closed the thick file and folded his hands on top of it. His sharp eyes studied my face, waiting for my reaction. "Quincy," he said quietly, "the decoy account you gave him access to only holds $200,000. Even if he drains every single penny of it today, it will barely make a dent in the massive hole he has dug for himself. The loan sharks alone will demand more than that just to keep him walking and breathing. He is going to need a lot more cash, and he is going to need it fast. The initial theft was just him testing the waters to see if you would notice. When he realizes that $200,000 is not enough to stop the auditors and the thugs, he will have to look for a bigger prize." I leaned forward, a grim, calculated smirk spreading across my face. I knew exactly how a desperate man's mind worked. I had seen it 100 times in the brutal world of corporate logistics. I looked at Bradley, my voice a low, dangerous rumble. 200,000 is just the appetizer, Bradley. He knows he needs the main course to survive this mess. He thinks I am a senile old fool who does not know what is going on. Bradley raised an eyebrow, picking up his coffee cup. So what is his next move? I stood up from the leather chair, buttoning my tailored suit jacket with deliberate precision. His next target, I stated with absolute certainty, is my house. The rhythmic, metallic snap of a steel tape measure echoed through the quiet expanse of my living room. I lay perfectly still on the vintage velvet sofa, my eyes closed, controlling the steady rise and fall of my chest to mimic a deep afternoon slumber. The sunlight warmed my face, but a cold realization gripped my senses. There were strange, heavy footsteps pacing across my imported hardwood floors. It was a Tuesday morning, a time when my sprawling estate was usually enveloped in total silence. I focused my hearing, picking up the distinct clack of hard leather dress shoes mingling with the sharp click of high heels. I did not need to open my eyes to know exactly who was wearing those heels. Heather had brought an intruder into my sanctuary. The sheer audacity of her actions confirmed every single suspicion I had discussed with Bradley. Kendrick and Heather were moving faster than I anticipated, driven by the suffocating pressure of his massive debts. I kept my breathing slow and even, playing the part of the exhausted, oblivious old man they desperately wanted me to be. I waited in the shadows of my own pretending, listening to the thieves appraise my kingdom. The scent of cheap cologne wafted over me, confirming the presence of a stranger who had bypassed my security gates entirely on Heather's authorization. "This living space is absolutely cavernous," a male voice echoed across the high ceilings. He sounded slick, practiced the exact tone of a hungry real estate broker scenting a massive commission. "The bone structure of the property is magnificent, but the interior design is severely dated. We are looking at a complete cosmetic overhaul to maximize the market value for a fast flip." Heather let out a sharp, derisive laugh. "Tell me about it," she replied, her voice dripping with venom. My late mother-in-law had the aesthetic sensibilities of a flea market hoarder. All this heavy mahogany, the floral drapes, these antique rugs, it is entirely suffocating and frankly embarrassing. We plan to gut the entire main floor immediately. Open concept, modern fixtures, a total contemporary redesign. But right now, we just need a solid baseline appraisal for an expedited sale. How much is the dirt and the square footage worth as it sits today, assuming we list it by the end of the week? I heard the squeak of a digital laser measure and the scribbling of a pen on paper. The broker hummed thoughtfully, pacing the length of the grand foyer, his hard shoes clicking arrogantly against the wood. "Location is premium," he stated confidently. "You are in one of the most coveted zip codes outside Atlanta. The lot size alone is a goldmine for developers. With a fast-track listing and an aggressive buyer, you could easily clear $1.5 million. In cash. 30-day closing. $1.5 million. Heather gasped, the sheer greed vibrating in her vocal cords. "That is absolutely perfect. Kendrick will be thrilled to hear this projection. We can liquidate this dinosaur, put the old man in a state facility where he belongs, and finally have the capital to fund our actual lives. We have been stuck in that guest wing for 6 months playing nursemaid. It is time for us to cash out." I felt the blood roaring in my ears. She was standing in the exact spot where Lorraine had danced with me on our 30th wedding anniversary, casually plotting to sell my memories to the highest bidder to pay off her husband's illegal loan shark debts. She was already mentally spending my money, assuming my cognitive decline made me a blind spectator in my own home. I let them talk for another 2 minutes, gathering every toxic detail of their immediate plans. The broker began listing off necessary pre-sale repairs, completely unaware he was an accessory to attempted elder fraud. The time for observation was officially over. I opened my eyes. I did not struggle to sit up. I rose from the velvet sofa with the swift, fluid motion of a man decades younger, my posture completely straight, my gaze locked onto the stranger in my living room. "I do not recall scheduling an open house," I said. My voice was a low, resonant baritone that shattered the conversational hum like a shotgun blast. The real estate broker jumped, nearly dropping his laser measure. He was a young man in a cheap suit, his face instantly draining of color as he turned to face me. Heather gasped, stumbling backward and clutching her chest, genuinely startled by my sudden resurrection. "Quincy," she stammered, her fake southern sweetness frantically trying to reassert itself. We thought you were asleep. We were just getting some preliminary estimates for an insurance update. We want to make sure your assets are fully covered." I ignored her completely. I kept my eyes fixed on the broker, walking slowly and deliberately toward him until I was standing inches from his face. "I demand to know who you are and why you are trespassing on my private property," I stated, enunciating every single word with lethal precision. The broker looked terrified, his eyes darting frantically between me and Heather. "I am an appraiser, sir," he stuttered, taking a nervous step back, his professional confidence entirely shattered. "Mrs. Jenkins here invited me to evaluate the estate for a potential expedited listing. She told me the owner was preparing to transition to an assisted living facility. Mrs. Jenkins is dead," I told him, my voice turning into a blade of pure ice. "The woman standing next to you is a guest who has vastly overstepped her boundaries. I am the sole legal owner of this property. I am not transitioning anywhere. You have exactly 30 seconds to pack your equipment and walk out my front door before I call the local authorities and press formal charges for criminal trespassing." The young broker did not need to be told twice. He scrambled to gather his clipboard, and Laser Pointer muttered a frantic apology to the air and practically ran out of the front door. The heavy oak slammed shut behind him, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. I slowly turned my attention to Heather. She was no longer pretending to be startled. Her face was flushed with hot, unadulterated rage. The mask of the caring daughter-in-law had melted away, entirely revealing the entitled, vicious predator lurking underneath. We stood facing each other in the grand foyer, the battle lines permanently drawn. "You have absolutely no idea what you are doing," Heather hissed, her voice vibrating with pure malice. "You are a stubborn, senile old man standing in the way of progress. You do not need this massive house. You wander around these empty rooms like a ghost. You are just holding us back out of pure selfish spite because you cannot accept that your time is over." I looked at her with absolute disgust. "I built this house," I replied calmly, my voice steady and unyielding, "and I will burn it to the absolute ground before I let you or your pathetic husband sell it to pay off his criminal debts." Heather's eyes widened in sudden panic. Her breath hitched. She realized I knew far more than I was supposed to know. She did not formulate a clever response. She simply spun around on her expensive heels and stormed down the hallway toward the guest wing, her footsteps echoing like hammer strikes against the wood. I followed quietly, listening as she slammed her bedroom door and immediately dialed her phone. "Kendrick," she shrieked into the receiver, her voice loud enough to easily penetrate the thick wooden door. "He is awake. He knows we are trying to sell the house. He knows about the debts. The old fool kicked the appraiser out and threatened to call the cops. We cannot wait for the medical evaluation anymore. He is too alert. You need to do it now, Kendrick. Use the paperwork. Use the power of attorney and secure the capital today before he revokes everything. We are going to lose everything if you do not act right now." I stood in the hallway, a cold smile crossing my face. The panic was fully setting in. Her desperation was driving them right into the trap. They were about to make a massive, catastrophic mistake, and I was ready to let them do it. The house was suffocatingly quiet the following morning. Heather and Kendrick had locked themselves in the guest wing, undoubtedly scrambling to execute whatever panicked strategy she had screamed into the phone the day before. I maintained my usual routine, brewing a pot of strong black coffee in the kitchen. As I threw away the coffee grounds, a flash of thick premium paper caught my eye at the very bottom of the stainless steel trash can. It was pushed down deep, hidden beneath coffee filters and discarded food wrappers, a sloppy attempt at concealment. I pulled it out. It was a heavy envelope from Liberty National Bank, ripped aggressively in half. My name was printed on the front, but the letter had been intercepted before I could ever see it. I wiped off the grime, took the pieces to the marble island, and carefully aligned the jagged edges. The official bank seal glared back at me. This was not a standard account update or a promotional offer. It was a formal processing confirmation for a massive financial transaction. They thought I was too blind or too oblivious to notice my own mail missing. They thought they were invisible. I grabbed my reading glasses and smoothed out the wrinkled paper. The bold black letters at the top of the page spelled out a term that made the coffee turn to acid in my stomach. Reverse mortgage application approval. I read the details with a clinical detachment, processing the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. Kendrick had not just emptied the $200,000 decoy account. Driven by Heather's panicked phone call and the crushing weight of his underground debts, he had gone straight for the jugular. He was leveraging the equity of my estate, the very house I built from the ground up with Lorraine, to extract $800,000 in pure, untraceable cash. But there was a glaring fatal flaw in his rushed execution. The letter confirmed the receipt of the signed authorization documents. My son was a financial analyst. He knew perfectly well that the general power of attorney he tricked me into signing only granted him access to the specific decoy account we had discussed. It absolutely did not give him the legal authority to place a massive lien against my primary residence. To push this reverse mortgage through the fast-track approval process, Kendrick had to provide a direct notarized signature from the property owner. He had not just overstepped a boundary. He had crossed a massive, irreversible legal line. I stared at the confirmation page, my eyes locking onto the digital scan of the submitted signature at the bottom of the second page. It was a decent forgery mimicking the loops and angles of my handwriting, but I knew my own signature. Kendrick had sat in his room, desperate and sweating, and deliberately forged my name on federal lending documents. This was no longer just a case of elder financial abuse or a greedy son taking advantage of a legal loophole. This was a direct, premeditated violation of federal banking laws. He had transformed a messy family dispute into a major corporate crime. I folded the torn pieces of the letter, placed them carefully into a clear plastic folder, and walked straight to my car. I drove to the city with a singular icy purpose, the engine of my car roaring, matching the cold fury building in my chest. I bypassed the receptionist at Hayes & Associates and walked straight into Bradley's office. I dropped the plastic folder onto his desk without saying a single word. Bradley adjusted his glasses, pulled out the torn pieces of the bank letter, and began to read. I watched his face transition from professional curiosity to absolute unadulterated fury. His jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscles jumping under his skin. He slammed his hand flat against the oak desk, the sound echoing sharply in the quiet room. "Quincy, this is absolute insanity," Bradley barked, his voice laced with aggressive legal adrenaline. "This is not a gray area. This is not a civil dispute over a power of attorney. Your son just committed wire fraud, bank fraud, and aggravated identity theft. He forged your signature on a federal lending document to extract $800,000. He is defrauding a federally insured institution." Bradley did not wait for my response. He aggressively grabbed the heavy desk phone, his fingers flying across the keypad. "I am calling the regional director of the FBI field office right now," he declared, his eyes blazing with the thrill of the kill. "We are shutting this down immediately. We will have federal agents at his office before lunch. He is going to be walked out of that building in handcuffs, and he is going to spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary." The phone began to ring on the speaker, a sharp, piercing tone that promised immediate justice. I reached across the desk and firmly pressed my finger down on the receiver, cutting the connection dead. The dial tone dissolved into silence. Bradley stared at me, his eyes wide with absolute confusion and frustration. "What are you doing, Quincy?" he demanded, his voice rising in disbelief. "We have him dead to rights. The crime has been committed. The evidence is literally sitting right here in front of us. If we do not report this immediately, you could be held liable for the fraudulent loan. Let me make the call." I kept my hand on the receiver, my expression entirely impassive. I looked at my brilliant, aggressive lawyer with the calm certainty of a man who is playing a much longer, much deadlier game. "We are not calling the FBI today," I stated, my voice smooth and chillingly calm. Bradley shook his head, utterly baffled, throwing his hands up in the air. "Why in the world would we wait?" I leaned back in my chair and steepled my fingers, looking at the forged signature on the torn paper, because right now it is just a fraudulent application. If we stop it before the transaction clears, he can claim desperation. He can plead temporary insanity. He can hire a slick defense attorney and try to pass it off as a massive misunderstanding fueled by stress. He might negotiate a plea deal and get away with a slap on the wrist. I do not want a plea deal, Bradley. I want him completely destroyed. Bradley slowly lowered his hands, the realization beginning to dawn on his face. A cold professional respect replaced his initial anger. "You want him to actually receive the funds," Bradley whispered, finally understanding the depth of my strategy. "Exactly," I replied, a dark, merciless smile forming on my lips. "Let the bank approve the mortgage. Let them wire the $800,000 directly into his personal account. Let him feel the relief wash over him. Let him touch the money and start paying off those loan sharks and buying his wife more luxury cars. Once he accepts that wire transfer and spends a single dime of that stolen federal money, the trap locks permanently. There is no backtracking. There is no defense strategy that can save him. We let him hang himself with his own greed. The heavy gold fountain pen glided effortlessly across the crisp watermarked legal paper. The sound of the nib scratching against the document was the only noise in Bradley Hayes' corner office. I signed my name with deliberate precision, executing a maneuver I had kept in my back pocket for over a decade. Bradley sat across from me, watching with a mixture of professional awe and predatory anticipation. He took the signed document, stamped it with his official notary seal, and pressed it firmly into the thick oak desk. We were not stopping a crime today. We were elevating it to a level from which Kendrick could never ever recover. The reverse mortgage application my son had fraudulently submitted was processing at lightning speed. Banks were always eager to hand out cash when they believed they were securing a multi-million-dollar property as collateral. Kendrick thought he was putting a lien on a house owned by a tired, vulnerable old man. He thought he was dealing with Quincy Jenkins, the retired father he could easily manipulate and discard. But as the ink dried on the transfer deed in front of me, he was no longer dealing with his father. He was dealing with a ghost. Many years ago, long before I sold my logistics empire, I established a series of shell companies and holding entities to protect my assets from corporate vultures and market fluctuations. One of those entities was Q Logistics, LLC. It was a fully registered, legally binding commercial structure that I had kept entirely dormant since my retirement. Kendrick knew absolutely nothing about it. He assumed my wealth was sitting in simple checking accounts and standard real estate deeds. He lacked the fundamental business acumen to look deeper into my financial architecture. Bradley slid the next set of papers toward me. By executing this transfer of deed, I was officially moving the legal ownership of my entire sprawling estate out of my personal name and directly into the corporate holdings of Q Logistics, LLC. The transaction was backdated legally through a trust provision Bradley had drafted years ago. It was a flawless, impenetrable corporate shield. "This changes the entire landscape of the battlefield," Quincy Bradley explained, tapping his expensive pen against the fresh documents. "When Kendrick forged your signature on that reverse mortgage application, he committed aggravated identity theft and standard bank fraud. That alone is a severe crime. But by transferring the property into a corporate entity, before the loan officially closes, you have fundamentally altered the nature of his legal violation. He is no longer borrowing against personal residential equity. He is attempting to extract liquid capital from a registered commercial logistics holding company." I nodded, understanding the lethal legal mechanics perfectly. Kendrick was no longer just a greedy son stealing equity from his elderly father. He was an unauthorized individual attempting to leverage commercial real estate owned by a registered corporation. "He is defrauding a business entity," I stated, my voice devoid of any warmth. "Exactly," Bradley confirmed, a sharp grin forming on his face. "This elevates the fraud to a severe federal corporate crime level. When the bank discovers that they issued $800,000 based on a forged signature for a property owned by a logistics corporation, the federal regulatory agencies will step in immediately. They will not treat this as a domestic family dispute over an inheritance which local police often ignore or categorize as a civil matter. The Securities and Exchange Commission, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, and the FBI handle corporate wire fraud with absolute ruthlessness. The penalties jump from a few years of potential probation to decades in a federal penitentiary." I leaned back in the leather chair, staring at the finalized paperwork. Kendrick wanted to play the role of a high-rolling financial analyst. He wanted to manipulate the system to fund his reckless lifestyle, pay off his violent loan sharks, and satisfy his entitled wife. Now he was going to experience the full crushing weight of the system he thought he could outsmart. I authorized Bradley to file the transfer with the county clerk immediately. The trap was set, loaded, and primed. As I drove back to the estate, the wheels of Kendrick's destruction were already turning. The bank, completely unaware of the corporate transfer executing at the county level, processed the reverse mortgage application based on the forged documents. They saw a high-value property, an impeccable credit history belonging to me, and a signed authorization. They pushed the approval through their expedited underwriting department without a second thought. Later that evening, while I sat in my study reviewing the finalized Q Logistics LLC portfolio, the transaction officially cleared. $800,000 was wired directly into a joint checking account controlled by Kendrick and Heather. I did not need to see their bank statement to know the money had arrived. The immediate shift in the atmosphere of the house was palpable. The suffocating tension that had radiated from the guest wing for the past few days vanished instantly. It was replaced by the loud, obnoxious sounds of unearned victory. I walked quietly down the main hallway, stopping just short of their suite. The door was wide open this time. They were not hiding anymore. They felt completely invincible. A delivery driver from the most expensive seafood restaurant in the city had just dropped off a massive spread. I could smell the rich, buttery aroma of roasted lobster tails, prime filet mignon, and expensive garlic truffles filling the corridor. The sharp pop of a champagne cork echoed off the walls, a vintage bottle that cost more than a month of groceries, followed by Heather's shrill, triumphant laughter. "We actually did it," Kendrick shouted, his voice thick with a mixture of disbelief and arrogant pride. $800,000, it is sitting right there in the account. The bank did not even blink. "I told you I could handle the underwriting process. I am an absolute financial genius." Heather giggled, the sound of crystal clinking as they toasted their massive felony. "We are paying off those absolute thugs tomorrow morning," she declared, her tone completely devoid of any moral conflict. "We will clear the underground debt, wipe the crypto margins clean, and then we are booking first-class tickets to Monaco. We deserve a luxury vacation after dealing with this stressful, suffocating environment, and we need to finalize the plans for the state facility immediately. With this kind of liquid cash, we can bypass the standard waiting lists. We can hire a private medical transport to come get your father by the end of the week. We can have him evaluated, declared incompetent, and shipped out before he even understands what is happening. We do not have to wait around in this depressing house anymore." They were feasting on stolen money, celebrating a victory built entirely on federal wire fraud. They were eating lobster and drinking vintage champagne, completely oblivious to the fact that they were dining on the edge of an active volcano. They thought the $800,000 was their ultimate salvation, a golden ticket out of their miserable, debt-ridden existence. They did not realize that every single dollar in that account was a heavy iron chain wrapping securely around their ankles. I returned to the quiet sanctuary of my study and sat behind my mahogany desk. My phone buzzed on the smooth wooden surface. The screen lit up with a new text message. It was from Heather. She had sent a photograph. It was a selfie of her and Kendrick holding up crystal flutes filled with bubbling champagne, wide, greedy smiles plastered across their faces. The caption underneath read, "Celebrating some successful investments tonight. So glad your portfolio is in capable hands now, Quincy." She was mocking me. She was actively rubbing my perceived defeat in my face, confident that the senile old man she was planning to lock away in a sterile medical ward would simply accept the lie and fade into obscurity. I looked at the photograph for a long time. I did not feel a single ounce of anger or betrayal. Those emotions had burned away days ago. All I felt was the cold, calculating satisfaction of a predator watching a blind, foolish animal walk directly into a steel snare. They were happily chewing on the bait, totally unaware that the jaws were about to snap shut. I locked my phone and leaned back in my chair, a dark, merciless smile spreading across my face. "Enjoy the champagne, Kendrick," I whispered to the empty room. "It is going to be the last decent meal you have for the next 20 years. The morning after their lavish celebration of federal wire fraud, the atmosphere in the house shifted from triumphant to overtly hostile. I walked into my own kitchen to find my usual spot at the mahogany dining table occupied by a glossy, brightly colored brochure. It was placed meticulously next to my morning coffee mug, impossible to overlook. I picked it up, feeling the cheap, stiff paper between my fingers. Shady Pines Assisted Living. The name sounded pleasant enough, but a quick glance at the blurry photographs revealed the grim reality. It was a notoriously underfunded state facility located on the industrial edge of the city, a place where forgotten people were sent to fade away in cramped, sterile rooms. Heather had not left it there by accident. It was a deliberate, calculated, psychological strike. She was marking her territory and sending a clear, aggressive message. The psychological warfare had officially begun. She wanted me to look at that bleak, depressing building and accept it as my inevitable future. I set the brochure back down, aligning it exactly as I had found it. If she wanted to play mind games, I was more than ready to step onto the board. I had negotiated contracts with ruthless union bosses for decades. A greedy daughter-in-law was completely out of her depth. Heather glided into the kitchen a few minutes later wearing expensive silk pajamas, undoubtedly bought with my stolen money. She poured herself a cup of espresso and leaned against the granite counter watching me with a predatory smirk. "Looking for your reading glasses, Quincy?" she asked, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "You have been wandering around the kitchen for 10 minutes looking completely lost." I knew exactly where I had left my glasses. They were on my nightstand right next to the framed photograph of Lorraine, but when I woke up this morning, they were gone. My car keys, which I always hung on the brass hook by the front door, had also magically vanished in the night. It was classic textbook gaslighting. She was actively trying to manufacture the cognitive decline they desperately needed to justify my forced removal. I looked at her, maintaining a confused, slightly panicked expression. "I swear I left them by the bed," I muttered, patting my pockets uselessly. Heather sighed dramatically, rolling her eyes as if my mere existence was a massive burden on her day. "Quincy, this is getting genuinely concerning," she said, taking a slow sip of her coffee. "Yesterday you forgot where you put the mail, and today you cannot even find your own glasses. Kendrick and I are incredibly worried about your mental deterioration. It is not safe for you to be living in a house this size all by yourself." Her words were slow-measured and unspeakably cruel. She was weaponizing my age against me, trying to break my spirit and erode my confidence. "You are becoming a danger to yourself," she continued, stepping closer to me. "Your memory is failing. Your mind is slipping away. Look at you. You cannot even remember where you put your keys. How can you possibly manage a multi-million-dollar estate when you cannot even manage your own morning routine?" It is pathetic, really. It breaks my heart to see a man who used to be so sharp turn into such a helpless liability. She did not feel a single ounce of pity. She was thoroughly enjoying every second of my supposed humiliation. She was trying to strip away my dignity layer by layer until there was nothing left but a compliant, broken old man who would quietly pack his bags and surrender his kingdom. I knew exactly what I had to do. If they wanted a broken, senile old man, I would give them an Oscar-worthy performance. I walked over to the refrigerator and pulled out a heavy glass pitcher of cold water. I reached into the upper cabinet for a crystal tumbler. As I lifted the pitcher, I intentionally let my right hand begin to shake. I did not make it a violent jerk, but rather a subtle, uncontrollable tremor that radiated up my forearm and into my wrist. I poured the water, letting the heavy glass lip of the pitcher clatter loudly against the rim of the tumbler. Water splashed over the sides in erratic spurts, pooling rapidly on the expensive granite countertop. Heather watched me, her smirk widening into a look of absolute malicious triumph. Kendrick walked into the kitchen right at that moment, adjusting his expensive silk tie just in time to witness the final act of my performance. I picked up the filled tumbler, my hand shaking violently, now spilling water down my sleeve. I brought it halfway to my mouth, then simply allowed my fingers to go completely limp. The heavy crystal glass slipped from my grasp and shattered violently against the hard tile floor. Water and jagged shards of glass exploded outward, covering the tips of my leather slippers. I did not flinch. I did not apologize or jump back. I simply stood there, staring down at the mess with a vacant, soulless expression. I let my jaw go slack and allowed my eyes to glaze over, staring blankly at the wall behind Kendrick. I made sure I looked completely detached from reality, a man whose mind had retreated into a dark, inaccessible corner. "What is wrong with him?" Kendrick asked, his voice laced with sudden urgency as he stepped away from the splashing water. Heather stepped back, avoiding the puddle nearing her silk pajamas. "Look at him, Kendrick," she said, pointing at me as if I were a defective piece of machinery. "His mind is completely gone. He is shaking. He is dropping things. He does not even know where he is right now. I told you he was deteriorating rapidly." I remained perfectly still, blinking slowly, maintaining the empty, confused stare. Inside, my mind was sharper than a razor. I was calculating every angle, analyzing their reactions. My performance had worked flawlessly. They were looking at me and seeing exactly what they needed to see to justify their ultimate betrayal. They truly believed I was a ruined, helpless old man standing in a puddle of water, completely incapable of fighting back. Kendrick stared at the shattered glass on the floor, and then he looked up at my blank, unresponsive face. The hesitation that usually clouded his eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, desperate resolve. The infusion of the stolen $800,000 had emboldened him, but seeing me in this pathetic, fabricated state gave him the final push he needed to completely sever his conscience. "We cannot wait until the end of the month," Kendrick stated, his voice hard and uncompromising. He turned to Heather, stepping over the broken crystal. "He is completely slipping away. If he wanders out of the house or leaves the stove on, he could burn this entire place to the ground before we even get a chance to sell it. I am not risking our capital equity. Call the facility right now. Tell them we are expediting the transfer. We need him packed up and out of this house by the end of the week." Heather smiled, a genuine, terrifying expression of pure victory. "I will make the call immediately," she promised. I kept my eyes glazed over, staring vacantly at the kitchen cabinets, but my heart beat with a steady, lethal rhythm. The countdown had officially started. They wanted me out by the end of the week. That gave me exactly the time frame I needed to spring the trap. The very next morning, the heavy brass knocker on my front door echoed through the grand foyer with a violent, demanding rhythm. I did not rush. I shuffled my feet, taking slow, deliberate steps, maintaining the flawless facade of a frail, deteriorating old man. When I finally pulled the heavy oak door open, the bright morning sunlight was entirely blocked out by two massive figures standing on my front porch. They were not friendly neighborhood visitors. They were two incredibly muscular, broad-shouldered men wearing crisp, sterile white medical scrubs. Their thick arms were crossed over their massive chests, their faces completely devoid of any human empathy or warmth. They looked less like healthcare professionals and more like nightclub bouncers hired specifically to enforce a hostile eviction. The dark blue logo of Shady Pines Assisted Living was stitched aggressively onto the breast pockets of their cheap synthetic uniforms. Standing just behind these two imposing human walls were Kendrick and Heather. Heather wore a sharp-tailored black pantsuit, her arms crossed in a perfect mirror image of the orderlies, an arrogant sneer permanently fixed to her face. Kendrick held a thick leather portfolio tightly against his chest, shifting his weight nervously from foot to foot. He was bringing hired muscle to his own father's house. The visual intimidation was a pathetic, transparent tactic designed to terrify a supposedly confused senior citizen into absolute, unquestioning submission. I looked up at the two giants, keeping my hands trembling slightly against the wooden door frame, letting my eyes widen in manufactured fear. Kendrick pushed past the two hulking orderlies, completely ignoring standard social boundaries, and marched directly into my grand foyer. He did not ask for permission to enter the house I had built with my own hands. He acted as if he already owned every single brick and plank of wood. He walked briskly into the adjacent sitting room, his hard leather shoes clicking aggressively against the polished floor, and slapped the heavy leather portfolio down onto the glass coffee table. Heather followed closely behind him, her heels snapping like gunfire, motioning for the two massive orderlies to step inside and stand guard by the entrance. They positioned themselves like stone gargoyles, crossing their arms and staring straight ahead, blocking my only exit. Kendrick unzipped the portfolio and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He tossed a heavy gold-plated pen on top of the paperwork. The metallic clatter echoed sharply in the tense room. "It is time," Dad Kendrick declared, his voice carrying a fake practiced authority that failed to hide his underlying desperation. "We have arranged for your immediate transfer to Shady Pines. These gentlemen are here to safely transport you to the facility. All you need to do is sign this voluntary admission consent form. It is for your own medical safety and cognitive well-being. The doctors are waiting for you right now." I looked down at the stack of papers. The top sheet clearly stated voluntary transfer and relinquishment of medical autonomy. It was a complete surrender of my human rights disguised as healthcare. I looked back up at Kendrick, channeling every ounce of my acting ability. I let my shoulders droop dramatically, my jaw trembling slightly. "I cannot leave my home, Kendrick," I whispered, ensuring my voice sounded incredibly frail, cracked, and completely terrified. "This is my house. Lorraine and I built this place. All my memories are right here. Please do not make me go to a hospital. I am perfectly fine. I just need a little more rest." Heather let out a loud, dramatic sigh of pure exasperation, rolling her eyes toward the ceiling as if dealing with a toddler. "Quincy, stop being so incredibly difficult," she snapped, her voice harsh and completely devoid of any artificial sweetness. "You are not fine. You broke a crystal glass yesterday because your hands are failing. You cannot remember where you put your own keys. You are a massive liability to yourself and to us. We are not asking for your permission anymore. We are telling you what is happening. Sign the paper right now so these nice men can pack your bags and get you out of here before you accidentally burn the property down." I kept my hands clasped tightly together, shaking them visibly. "No," I stammered, backing away slightly, playing the role of a cornered, frightened victim to absolute perfection. "I will not sign it. You cannot force me out of my own house. I will call the police. I will tell them you are trying to kidnap me." Kendrick slammed his fist against the glass coffee table, losing his temper completely. The sudden violent noise made the two orderlies shift their weight, ready to intervene at a moment's notice. "You are not calling anyone," Kendrick shouted, the veins popping in his neck as his frustration boiled over. The thin veneer of the concerned, loving son completely shattered, revealing the ruthless, desperate criminal underneath. Kendrick leaned over the glass table, his face turning an ugly shade of red, pointing an accusatory finger directly at my chest. "You do not get to dictate terms anymore, old man," he sneered, his voice dropping into a low, threatening register. "You think this is still your kingdom. You think you still have any leverage here. You are completely delusional. I was trying to do this the nice, quiet way, but you leave me absolutely no choice." He reached back into his leather portfolio and yanked out another stack of documents, waving them aggressively in the air before slamming them down next to the admission form. "Take a good hard look at reality, Dad," Kendrick demanded, his eyes wide with frantic, greedy energy. "You do not own this house free and clear anymore. I used the power of attorney. I secured a massive reverse mortgage against this entire estate. The bank has already approved the lien, and the capital has already been fully dispersed into an account that I control exclusively. You have absolutely zero financial leverage. You cannot afford to maintain this property, pay the property taxes, or even keep the lights on without my direct authorization." I stared at him, maintaining my wide-eyed, terrified expression while internally my mind roared with cold satisfaction. He had just verbally confessed to his financial crimes in front of witnesses. He had admitted to leveraging the estate, fully believing his forged signature on the reverse mortgage application was a bulletproof shield. He was incredibly proud of his massive felony. He stood there puffing his chest out, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just admitted to a federal crime. "You stole from me," I whispered, letting a single convincing tear of betrayal form in the corner of my eye. "You took my home." "I did what I had to do to secure the family legacy," Kendrick shot back without a single ounce of remorse. "You were going to squander it away on community centers and charity handouts. Now I have the liquid capital to actually build something substantial. The bank owns the equity now, and I control the cash. Your name on the deed means absolutely nothing anymore." Heather stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with her criminal husband, a vicious, triumphant smile plastered across her face. "So here is how this is going to work. Quincy," she stated, taking absolute command of the situation, "we are canceling the medical transport for today, but you are not staying here. We are giving you exactly 3 days, 72 hours to pack whatever pathetic, outdated clothes and useless, sentimental garbage you want to keep. On Friday morning, these two gentlemen will return with a moving van. If you are not packed and ready to walk out that front door voluntarily, they have strict instructions to physically escort you off the premises and transport you directly to the state ward." Kendrick picked up his portfolio, leaving the medical consent form and the fraudulent bank documents spread out on the glass table as a visual threat. 3 days, Dad Kendrick finalized, his voice completely devoid of any familial warmth. "Do not make this any harder than it has to be. Pack your bags." Without waiting for my response, Kendrick and Heather turned on their heels and marched toward the grand foyer. They signaled the two massive orderlies, who gave me one last intimidating glare before following them out. The heavy front door slammed shut with a thunderous boom that vibrated through the floorboards. The lock clicked, plunging the house back into total, absolute silence. I stood frozen in the center of the sitting room for exactly 10 seconds, listening to the muffled sound of Kendrick's luxury SUV starting up and roaring down the long driveway. Once the engine noise completely faded away into the distance, my entire physical demeanor transformed in the blink of an eye. The trembling in my hands vanished instantly. The frightened, stooped posture evaporated like smoke. I stood up perfectly straight, rolling my broad shoulders back, the full strength and commanding presence of my 69 years returning in an unstoppable wave. I calmly walked over to the glass coffee table, picked up the medical consent form they had tried to force upon me, and ripped it methodically into tiny confetti-sized pieces, letting them fall uselessly into the trash can. They had played their final hand. They had revealed their ultimate weapon and given me a strict deadline. 3 days. 72 hours. It was more than enough time. I pulled my smartphone from my tailored pocket, my face settling into a mask of pure, ruthless determination. I opened my encrypted contact list. The 72-hour countdown had officially begun, but it was not counting down to my eviction. It was counting down to their total, inescapable annihilation. 72 hours. In the high-stakes world of corporate logistics, 72 hours is an absolute eternity. It is more than enough time to reroute an entire fleet of freight trucks across the eastern seaboard, renegotiate a massive union contract, or completely dismantle a rival competitor. It was certainly enough time to destroy a foolish young man who had absolutely no idea he was at war. My first countermeasure did not take place in a sterile boardroom or a quiet bank lobby. It happened in the damp, neon-lit alleys of the city's industrial east side. I made a single phone call from an unregistered, prepaid cell phone to a courier I had trusted for over 20 years. He was a man who knew how to move things quietly. Later that night, he walked up to the reinforced steel service door of a notoriously violent underground nightclub. He did not knock. He did not announce his presence. He simply slid a thick, plain manila envelope through the narrow gap at the bottom of the heavy metal door and immediately disappeared back into the shadows. Inside that unmarked envelope was a very specific, highly curated set of documents. It contained a pristine copy of the bank wire confirmation showing exactly $800,000 dropping into Kendrick's joint checking account. Clipped directly behind that financial statement was a printed copy of the flight itinerary Heather had foolishly booked using my unsecured home network router. 2 first-class one-way tickets to Monaco scheduled for a rapid departure this coming weekend. There was no handwritten note attached. There was no return address. Men who operate illegal high-interest loan shark syndicates do not need a long explanation. When they see a debtor suddenly flush with massive amounts of liquid cash and holding international flight tickets, they do the brutal math instantly. I did not stop my offensive with the criminal underworld. You do not run a massive multi-state transportation empire for 4 decades without making powerful, highly influential connections. I knew senior bank managers, federal financial auditors, and private corporate fixers. I sat down at my heavy mahogany desk, opened a secure encrypted browser on my laptop, and went to work on the white-collar side of Kendrick's impending nightmare. I drafted a highly technical anonymous tip directed straight to the Central Fraud and Risk Assessment Division of Liberty National Bank. I did not write it sounding like an angry, betrayed father. I wrote it using the precise clinical terminology of a high-level corporate whistleblower. I detailed the exact routing numbers, the specific transaction identifiers, and the precise timestamps of the reverse mortgage payout. I flagged the entire $800,000 transfer as a severe imminent flight risk. I explicitly stated that the primary account holder was actively attempting to execute a massive capital flight to a non-extradition European territory. I warned the banking executives that the funds were directly tied to a compromised commercial asset and that allowing the money to cross international borders would result in a total unrecoverable loss for their federally insured institution. Banks are notoriously slow and bureaucratic when it comes to standard customer service, but when you directly threaten their bottom line and use federal trigger phrases like international capital flight, their internal security algorithms act with absolute ruthless speed. I hit the send button and firmly closed the laptop. My son was currently sitting in the luxurious guest wing of my estate, likely packing his expensive designer clothes and dreaming of Mediterranean yachts. He genuinely believed he was a master manipulator. He thought his clumsily forged signature had secured his ultimate financial freedom. He was completely oblivious to the fact that I had just painted a massive glowing bullseye on his back for both the federal banking system and the most dangerous criminals in the city. He wanted my money to save his miserable life. I just made sure that holding my money was the most dangerous, toxic thing in the world. The results of my dual-pronged attack manifested with terrifying, beautiful efficiency over the next 48 hours. The invisible net I had carefully cast began to violently pull tight around the guest wing. On Thursday morning, I sat comfortably in my study with a fresh cup of dark roast coffee, watching the newly installed high-definition security camera feeds on my large desktop monitor. The screen displayed multiple crystal-clear angles of the long suburban driveway, the wrought iron front gates, and the perimeter of the guest suite. At approximately 10 in the morning, the quiet energy of the street outside my estate shifted dramatically. A sleek, blacked-out sedan with heavily tinted windows slowly rolled past the front gates. It did not stop, but it crawled at a calculated predator's pace. 10 minutes later, a battered dark gray SUV parked on the opposite side of the street, directly in the line of sight of Kendrick's bedroom windows. Two muscular men wearing cheap leather jackets and dark sunglasses stepped out into the morning light. They leaned heavily against the hood of their vehicle, smoking cigarettes, their eyes fixed aggressively on my property. These were not local neighborhood watch volunteers. They were the brutal debt collectors. The loan sharks had received my anonymous envelope, and they were absolutely not going to politely wait for Kendrick to return their phone calls. They were establishing a hard physical perimeter. They were making sure their $800,000 investment did not make it anywhere near the international airport. Inside the house, the digital walls were closing in just as fast and just as hard. I could hear the muffled, frantic sounds of panicked arguments bleeding through the thick walls from the guest suite. Heather was shrieking at the top of her lungs. I did not need a hidden recording device to know exactly what was happening in there. They had tried to transfer the funds to an offshore account. They had tried to pay for their luxury accommodations in Monaco, and they had hit a solid, impenetrable brick wall. The bank's risk assessment division had reacted exactly as I predicted. Triggered by the anonymous tip and the highly suspicious international booking, the bank had placed a hard administrative freeze on the entire account. The $800,000 was sitting right there on their mobile banking application, totally visible, but absolutely inaccessible. It was frozen solid pending a full internal fraud investigation. Kendrick was completely trapped. He had the money to pay off the violent men standing right outside my gates, but he could not touch a single solitary dime of it. The blind panic in his voice echoed down the long hallway. The walls of his fake empire were collapsing inward, crushing him under the massive weight of his own greed. The 72-hour deadline arrived with the bright, crisp dawn of Friday morning. This was the exact day Kendrick and Heather had scheduled my forced medical removal. The muscular orderlies from Shady Pines were likely already en route with a large moving van, expecting to easily drag a terrified, confused old man out of his beloved home. They were going to be severely disappointed. I stood in my master bedroom and methodically packed a single compact leather valise. I packed only my essential tailored clothing, my important corporate legal documents, and the framed photograph of Lorraine from my nightstand. I did not take anything else. I did not need to. I dressed in a sharp, dark, tailored suit, adjusting my silver cufflinks with absolute, unwavering calm. I walked down the grand staircase, the heavy silence of the main house broken only by the distant, frantic pacing coming from the guest wing. Kendrick and Heather were locked in a nightmare of their own making, surrounded by violent gangsters outside and federal bank auditors inside. I bypassed the main front door entirely. I walked out the discreet side service entrance, crossed the manicured lawn, and slipped quietly into the driver's seat of my reliable, unassuming sedan. I started the engine and drove out of the secondary service gate, leaving the sprawling estate behind me in the morning sun. I was not fleeing my home. I was simply clearing the blast radius before the bomb detonated. I drove away down the tree-lined street, a cold, satisfied smile fixed on my face, leaving the grand stage entirely to the pathetic clowns who foolishly believed they were directing the play. I settled into the quiet, absolute luxury of a downtown penthouse suite, a temporary headquarters I had secured well in advance of my departure. I poured myself a single glass of neat 20-year-old bourbon, opened my encrypted laptop, and accessed the high-definition security feeds surrounding my estate. I fully expected to see Kendrick and Heather locked in a state of absolute paralyzed panic. With their fraudulent bank account frozen solid by federal investigators and violent loan sharks actively circling the perimeter gates, any rational human being would be barricading the heavy oak doors, pulling the curtains shut, and begging for police protection. But rationality requires a fundamental connection to reality. Delusion, as I was about to witness firsthand, is a remarkably powerful and blinding narcotic. Instead of cowering in the guest wing and plotting their escape, my son and his entitled wife had decided to throw a massive celebration. The audio feed from the main living room picked up the heavy, rhythmic thumping of an obnoxious bass track. I switched the monitor to the exterior driveway cameras and watched in mild clinical disbelief as a steady stream of luxury vehicles began to fill my pristine, brick-paved courtyard. Porsche's late-model Range Rovers and sleek Mercedes sedans parked haphazardly across the manicured front lawn, completely disrespecting the landscaping Lorraine had meticulously designed. Heather had apparently invited her entire shallow high society social circle for an impromptu lavish victory party. She was actively playing the role of the grand wealthy matriarch, parading through my formal foyer in a skin-tight sequined designer cocktail dress. She held a crystal flute of expensive champagne in her hand, floating from group to group, as if she had personally laid the concrete foundation of the sprawling estate herself. I toggled the audio feeds on my laptop, focusing directly on the main reception area to monitor their conversations. The sheer audacity of their public performance was almost hypnotic in its absolute wickedness. Heather was leading a group of heavily Botoxed, deeply superficial women through the formal dining room, waving her manicured hand dismissively at Lorraine's priceless antique furniture and custom drapery. "We are completely gutting all of this garbage by next Tuesday morning," Heather announced loudly, her voice projecting arrogantly over the thumping music. "It is all going straight to the local landfill where it belongs. We are bringing in a highly exclusive minimalist architectural designer from New York to completely modernize the entire space. We are tearing down these suffocating walls and opening up the floor plan. It is going to be absolutely breathtaking once we scrub the old scent out of it." One of her affluent friends, a woman dripping in expensive diamond jewelry, looked around the massive estate with obvious, undisguised envy. "I simply cannot believe your father-in-law just handed this incredible historic property over to you both," she said, taking a sip of her drink. "I heard he was incredibly stubborn and deeply attached to this place. How did you manage to convince him to let it go?" Heather did not even blink. She did not hesitate for a single second. She unleashed a lie so brazen, so perfectly rehearsed, and deeply evil, it made the blood run cold in my veins. Quincy finally recognized that the physical and financial maintenance of this estate was just too much for his rapidly declining mind. She lied smoothly, taking a delicate practiced sip of her champagne. "He came to Kendrick and me in tears earlier this week. He was so incredibly terrified of his own confusion. He voluntarily requested to be moved to a specialized wellness facility upstate where he can get the round-the-clock psychiatric care and supervision he desperately needs right now. He explicitly wanted Kendrick and me to take over the estate so we could finally build our own legacy without the burden of his medical issues holding us back. He practically begged us to take the keys and save him from himself." Kendrick walked right into the camera frame at that exact moment. He was wearing a tailored velvet dinner jacket, actively playing the part of the burdened, highly successful, and dutiful heir. "It was an incredibly difficult transition for the family," Kendrick added smoothly. He put a comforting, supportive arm around Heather's waist, adopting a sickening tone of fake, heavy sorrow. "But Dad knew his time as the head of this family was officially over. He transferred the equity and the legal control to me because he implicitly trusts my financial vision for the future. I am currently restructuring his entire outdated portfolio. This massive house is just the beginning of our new corporate footprint in this city." I sat alone in my dark penthouse, watching the high-definition monitor with a cold, unforgiving, and merciless stare. They were standing directly on top of a literal financial landmine. Their stolen bank accounts were securely locked down by federal fraud investigators. Violent, unforgiving underground debt collectors were literally sitting in a rusted vehicle just a few hundred yards outside the front gate, watching these shiny luxury cars roll in with predatory interest. Yet their insatiable vanity and desperate need for social validation forced them to throw a masquerade ball to impress people who would instantly abandon them the second the money officially dried up. The illusion of success mattered infinitely more to them than their actual physical survival. They were drinking expensive champagne on the deck of a rapidly sinking ship, loudly boasting about the spectacular ocean view. The obnoxious celebration reached its absolute peak just after 9 o'clock in the evening. Kendrick stood proudly at the top of the grand, sweeping staircase in the foyer. He tapped a silver spoon aggressively against his crystal glass to command the attention of the packed buzzing room. The hired DJ immediately lowered the music, and a wave of expectant, eager silence washed over the dozens of wealthy guests. "I want to raise a toast to the bright future," Kendrick declared loudly, raising his glass high into the air. His face was flushed red with expensive alcohol and unearned stolen pride. To new beginnings, massive corporate acquisitions, and the Jenkins family legacy entering its most profitable dominant era yet. The guests raised their glasses in unison, preparing to cheer and drink to his fraudulent health. But before a single drop of champagne could be consumed, a sudden violent sound shattered the celebratory atmosphere entirely. It was not the polite, hesitant tap of a late-arriving party guest. It was the heavy, authoritative, bone-rattling pounding of the solid brass knocker striking the thick oak front door. The sound echoed through the cavernous foyer with the undeniable crushing force of a judge's wooden gavel striking a sounding block. Kendrick frowned deeply, clearly annoyed by the unexpected interruption to his grand self-aggrandizing speech. He handed his crystal glass to Heather and strutted aggressively down the carpeted stairs, waving away a hired waiter who had moved to answer the knock. "I will handle this," he muttered loudly, completely confident that he was the absolute, unquestioned master of his domain. He grabbed the heavy brass handle and yanked the oak door wide open, a condescending, arrogant remark already forming on his lips to dismiss whoever was bothering him. The arrogant remark died instantly in his throat. Standing on the grand front porch, bathed in the harsh, bright glare of the security lighting, was not a late-party guest or a complaining neighbor. It was my attorney, Bradley Hayes. Bradley was dressed in a sharp, immaculate charcoal suit, his face set in a rigid mask of absolute clinical ruthlessness. He did not come to the property alone. Flanking him on either side were two massive, stern-faced, uniformed court enforcement officers. The heavy silver badges pinned to their chests glinted menacingly under the porch lights. They stood with their hands resting casually but purposefully near their utility belts, projecting an aura of undeniable, overwhelming legal authority. The residual thumping bass of the background music was abruptly killed by a terrified DJ who instantly recognized the presence of law enforcement. The polite murmurs, the clinking glasses, and the arrogant laughter of the high society guests evaporated into a suffocating dead silence. The wealthy attendees froze completely in place, their champagne flutes hovering awkwardly in the air as they stared at the front door. Heather pushed her way to the front of the bewildered crowd, her confident, victorious smirk instantly replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. The sudden, aggressive presence of law enforcement in the exact middle of her victory parade was a harsh reality check she had never anticipated in her wildest dreams. Bradley did not yell. He did not raise his voice or make a dramatic emotional scene. He simply stepped heavily over the threshold, invading their precious party with the chilling, inevitable calmness of an executioner stepping onto the wooden scaffold. He reached into his slim leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, legally bound document stamped prominently with a massive, undeniable red court seal. "Kendrick Jenkins." "Heather Jenkins," Bradley stated. His voice was a low, booming baritone that cut through the silent room with lethal surgical precision. "You are hereby officially served with a mandatory emergency court summons." Kendrick stared blankly at the thick document, the color completely draining from his face until he looked physically ill. His arrogant, broad-shouldered posture collapsed inward, leaving him looking like a terrified, cornered child. "What is this?" he stammered, his voice cracking pitifully in the dead quiet of the foyer. "I have the general power of attorney. I own the equity in this estate. You cannot just barge in here and disrupt my home." Bradley shoved the heavy document directly into Kendrick's trembling chest, forcefully compelling him to take hold of it. "You do not own a single thing in this house," Bradley replied coldly, his sharp eyes locking onto Kendrick's terrified, darting gaze. "You are hereby ordered by a superior court judge to appear at my law offices immediately for the mandatory execution and formal unsealing of the Quincy Jenkins Living Trust. Failure to comply with this specific summons tonight will result in your immediate physical arrest for blatant contempt of court. A living trust." The words hit Kendrick like a physical, devastating blow to the head. The smugness vanished completely, replaced by a creeping, icy dread that settled deep in his bones. He thought he held the ultimate keys to the kingdom. He suddenly realized a much larger, legally impenetrable trap had just snapped violently shut around his throat. The timer had officially hit 0. The real reckoning was beginning. The late-night silence of the downtown financial district was broken only by the arrogant, heavy footsteps of my son and his wife. They marched out of the private executive elevator and into the sleek, dimly lit reception area of Hayes and Associates. Even after being served with a mandatory court summons in the exact middle of their fraudulent victory party, they somehow managed to cling to their delusion of absolute superiority. I could hear the sharp, aggressive clicking of Heather's designer heels striking the polished marble floor, echoing down the corridor like a petulant child demanding immediate attention. Kendrick was speaking loudly to the empty hallway, his voice thick with fake outrage and stolen courage, complaining bitterly about the sheer inconvenience of being dragged away from his important guests. They genuinely believed this emergency legal meeting was just a minor, easily fixable bureaucratic hurdle. They thought the living trust mentioned in the summons was simply an outdated document that needed to be officially dissolved to finalize Kendrick's absolute control over my entire estate. They assumed they were walking into a room to bully a confused, rapidly deteriorating old man into signing his final unconditional surrender. The heavy mahogany double doors to the primary conference room swung open violently. Kendrick stormed inside, aggressively adjusting the lapels of his tailored velvet dinner jacket, fully prepared to play the role of the burdened, impatient executive dealing with an incompetent parent. Heather marched right behind him, her arms crossed defensively over her sparkling sequined dress, her face locked in a vicious, entitled scowl. "This is an absolute, unforgivable outrage," Kendrick barked, projecting his voice into the large room before his eyes even adjusted to the lighting. "Dragging us down here in the middle of the night for some archaic legal formality is ridiculous. My father is entirely unfit to make any legally binding decisions. I hold the general power of attorney, and I demand that this circus be terminated immediately so we can return to our property." His voice echoed off the soundproof walls and then died instantly. The confident, arrogant words evaporated from his throat the exact second his eyes finally focused on the head of the massive black obsidian conference table. I was not slouched helplessly in a wheelchair. I was not wearing loose, comfortable house clothes. I was not staring blankly at the floor with the manufactured dementia I had flawlessly performed for them all week. I sat perfectly straight in the high-backed leather executive chair. I was wearing a bespoke three-piece charcoal suit that I had previously reserved only for hostile corporate takeovers and grueling boardroom battles. My posture was rigid, commanding, and radiated absolute, unquestionable authority. My hands rested flat on the cool stone surface of the table, entirely devoid of the fake tremors they had mocked just a few days ago. I looked directly at Kendrick, my eyes narrowed into a gaze as sharp and unforgiving as a straight razor. I did not look like a frail victim waiting for a nursing home transfer. I looked exactly like the ruthless self-made black man who had fought tooth and nail through decades of prejudice and economic hardship to crush rival logistics companies and build a regional empire with bare knuckles and an iron will. The physical shock that hit Kendrick and Heather was immediate, visceral, and absolutely devastating. They froze completely in their tracks, paralyzed by a reality they could not comprehend. Kendrick's mouth hung slightly open, his jaw slack. Heather dropped her arms to her sides, her aggressive scowl dissolving into a mask of pure, unfiltered bewilderment. They stared at me, their eyes wide, desperately trying to process the impossible transformation sitting right in front of them. The old broken man they had actively bullied and manipulated had completely vanished into thin air. In his place sat an apex predator, fully awake, fully aware, and glaring back at them with lethal, calculated intent. "Have a seat, Kendrick," I stated. My voice was a low, thunderous rumble that commanded absolute obedience. It did not crack or waver. It resonated with the heavy, crushing weight of a judge issuing a final, unappealable sentence. Before either of them could formulate a single word of protest or gather their shattered wits, Bradley Hayes stepped into the conference room right behind them. He did not offer them a warm greeting. He did not offer them a glass of water or a comfortable pleasantry. He bypassed them completely, reached for the heavy mahogany double doors, and pushed them firmly shut. A distinct, heavy electronic click echoed through the quiet room as the magnetic security lock engaged automatically. Heather spun around, her eyes widening in sudden, genuine alarm as the sound registered in her brain. "Did you just lock us in here?" she demanded, her voice pitching upward in a shrill tone of panic. "You cannot lock us in a room. This is false imprisonment. We are leaving this building right now." She lunged for the brass handle, pulling down on it with all her strength, but it refused to budge. The mechanism was entirely controlled from Bradley's side of the table. Bradley completely ignored her frantic pulling. He calmly walked over to his seat next to me, pulled a small black remote from his suit pocket, and pressed a single button. A sharp digital beep sounded from the upper corner of the ceiling. A small, high-definition security camera previously hidden in the shadows hummed to life. A bright, unblinking red light illuminated on its lens, staring directly down at Kendrick and Heather like a mechanical eye. For the strict purposes of federal and state compliance, this secure legal proceeding is now being actively recorded, Bradley announced loudly. His voice was entirely devoid of emotion, a clinical professional drone that sent immediate chills down the spine. Today is Friday. The current time is 10:45 in the evening. Present in this room are Quincy Jenkins, the sole creator and active executor of the Jenkins Living Trust, myself, Bradley Hayes, acting as senior legal counsel, and the two officially summoned parties, Kendrick Jenkins and Heather Jenkins. The expansive, luxurious conference room suddenly felt incredibly small and deeply suffocating. The lavish corporate setting instantly transformed into a cold, inescapable interrogation cell. The magnetic lock on the door and the glaring red light of the security camera stripped away the last remaining shreds of their arrogant confidence. They were stripped naked under the fluorescent lights of undeniable accountability. Kendrick slowly backed away from the locked door and practically collapsed into one of the leather guest chairs, his legs seemingly unable to support his own body weight any longer. Heather stood frozen next to him, her breathing shallow and rapid, her eyes darting nervously between me, the locked door, and the recording camera. They were fundamentally trapped. There was no affluent socialite audience to perform for, no fake facade of the caring family to hide behind, and absolutely no way to escape the brutal reality check that was about to rain down heavily on their heads. Bradley sat down deliberately and placed a massive black leather-bound binder onto the center of the obsidian table. The dull thud of the heavy document sounded exactly like a nail being driven into a wooden coffin. He unclasped the brass lock on the binder and flipped open the thick cover with slow, methodical precision. The atmosphere in the room turned as thick and dense as wet cement. Kendrick swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat. A thick layer of cold sweat began to form on his forehead despite the aggressively cool air conditioning pumping through the ceiling vents. Heather slowly lowered herself into the chair beside her husband, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the leather armrest so tightly her knuckles turned stark white. Every ounce of oxygen seemed to be systematically sucked out of the room, leaving them gasping for air in a total vacuum of their own making. We will now commence with the formal unsealing and immediate execution of the binding directives contained within this verified trust, Bradley stated, his eyes scanning the first page with merciless surgical precision. Directive number 1, effective immediately upon this reading. The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying. The steel jaws of the trap were securely locked, the captive audience was seated, and the heavy blade of the guillotine was officially released. Bradley adjusted his silver-framed glasses and looked down at the massive black binder. He cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the dense, suffocating silence of the locked conference room. Directive number 1. Bradley read, his voice projecting with clinical, undeniable authority. Effective immediately, any and all powers of attorney, medical proxies, and financial authorizations previously granted to Kendrick Jenkins are hereby permanently revoked. Bradley looked up from the document, his gaze locking onto my son. This explicit revocation completely neutralizes the general power of attorney, signed on Sunday evening. You no longer possess any legal right to access, manage, or transfer any personal assets, bank accounts, or healthcare decisions belonging to Quincy Jenkins. The legal language was absolute and impenetrable. The administrative guillotine had fallen, officially severing Kendrick from his ill-gotten control. The document completely stripped him of his perceived authority, rendering the piece of paper he had so eagerly snatched from my dining table absolutely worthless. I watched my son closely, expecting to see the final remnants of his confidence drain away. Instead, a very different reaction took hold. Kendrick let out a sharp, arrogant scoff. He leaned back in his leather chair, uncrossing his legs and crossing his arms defensively over his velvet dinner jacket. The initial suffocating fear that had gripped him when the doors magnetically locked seemed to temporarily evaporate, replaced by the smug, misguided confidence of a man who firmly believed he had already won the game. A condescending smirk spread across his face. He looked at me with a patronizing expression, completely convinced that my dramatic legal maneuvering was nothing more than a desperate, belated tantrum. "You are a little late for that," Dad Kendrick sneered, his voice dripping with arrogance. He actually laughed, a hollow, echoing sound that bounced off the soundproof walls. "You think revoking that piece of paper means anything right now? You think you trapped me. You are completely out of touch with reality. I already went to the bank, I already executed the transfers. That secondary account is completely drained. The money is gone. You are locking the vault after I already walked out the front door with the cash. You can revoke whatever you want, but you cannot undo what is already done. He puffed out his chest, genuinely proud of his petty theft, foolishly believing he held the ultimate high ground. He thought he had outsmarted a weary old man. I did not raise my voice. I did not exhibit a single ounce of anger. I simply leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cool obsidian table, and looked at him with profound, chilling pity. You are celebrating a pathetic illusion, Kendrick. I stated my voice a low, steady rumble that instantly wiped the smirk off his face. You think you robbed the kingdom, but you merely raided the petty cash drawer. That account you drained was a targeted decoy. It was specifically designed to see how quickly your greed would override your common sense. $200,000 is absolute pocket change to me. It is loose change I leave in the console of my car. It is dog food I threw out into the yard just to see if a stray animal would bite. And you bit down incredibly hard. His arrogant posture faltered instantly. The smug smile vanished, replaced by a sudden creeping confusion. He blinked rapidly, unable to comprehend the sheer scale of his miscalculation. A man who built a regional logistics empire from the ground up does not keep his actual wealth in a standard suburban checking account, I explained smoothly. You stole a fraction of my net worth, and you sold your entire soul to get it. The crushing realization began to set in, but Kendrick still did not grasp the full, devastating magnitude of his loss. Bradley turned the thick parchment page in the binder, moving seamlessly to the next phase of their destruction. Directive number 2. Bradley announced, cutting through Kendrick's rising panic. This directive constitutes the formal declaration of total assets and the irrevocable distribution of the Quincy Jenkins Living Trust. Bradley began to outline the actual unhidden extent of my financial empire. He listed the liquidated capital from the sale of my logistics company, the diversified municipal bond portfolios, the massive commercial real estate holdings spread across 4 southern states, and the high-yield offshore investment accounts. The final verified valuation of the estate sits at precisely $46,500,000, Bradley read clearly. Kendrick and Heather physically recoiled. Their eyes bulged with pure, unfiltered shock. They audibly gasped, all the air rushing out of their lungs. They had absolutely no idea the pool of wealth was that unimaginably deep. They thought the suburban estate and a few $100,000 were the absolute ceiling of my success. Then Bradley delivered the fatal blow. He read the distribution clause. I watched their pale faces intently as the lawyer detailed exactly where every single dime of that $46 million was going. Effective upon the activation of this trust, the entirety of the financial assets, properties, and capital are irrevocably transferred to the Lorraine Jenkins Philanthropic Foundation. The funds are strictly designated to finance urban development programs, provide full-ride college scholarships for underprivileged Black youth, and sustain community churches across the region. The exact people and institutions Heather had openly mocked as wanting handouts were receiving my entire fortune. Furthermore, Bradley continued, his voice echoing like a judge handing down a life sentence. This trust contains a strict, ironclad disinheritance clause. Kendrick Jenkins and his spouse Heather Jenkins are explicitly excluded from this trust. They shall receive absolutely nothing. Not a single cent. Not a piece of furniture. Not a family heirloom. They are permanently erased from this legacy. The unfathomable wealth they had been desperately drooling over, the massive fortune they had maliciously plotted to steal by locking me in a decaying state medical ward, was completely out of their reach forever. They were left with absolutely nothing. The fantasy of private jets, Mediterranean yachts, and endless unearned luxury crumbled into fine dust right before their horrified eyes. The crushing silence was violently shattered by Heather. The refined upper-class society mask completely disintegrated, revealing the raw, vicious entitlement underneath. She leaped up from her leather chair, her face contorted with ugly, visceral rage. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face, screaming at the top of her lungs. "You manipulative, vindictive monster!" she shrieked, her voice echoing aggressively off the walls and filling the room with toxic noise. "You absolute fraud! I wasted years of my life pretending to care about you. I lived in that suffocating house waiting for our rightful share, and you give it all away to a bunch of worthless charities. You stole our future." She hurled every desperate insult she could possibly think of, her composure totally destroyed by the staggering realization that she was walking away completely empty-handed. I did not flinch at her outburst. I did not respond to her frantic shrieking. I sat perfectly still, completely immune to her toxic, pathetic tantrum. I looked right past her frantic physical display and gave Bradley a slow, deliberate nod. Heather's explosive rage was just useless background noise. The loss of a massive inheritance was merely the financial punishment. The real inescapable destruction had not even been delivered yet. I signaled my lawyer to turn the page and read the next directive. It was time to hand down the absolute death sentence they had eagerly brought upon themselves. Bradley reached into his slim leather briefcase one final time. He did not pull out another trust addendum or a standard bank statement. He pulled out a single heavy sheet of watermarked county-stamped parchment paper. He placed his fingertips carefully on the top edge and slid it smoothly across the polished obsidian table. It came to a stop exactly halfway between Kendrick and myself. The official gold seal of the county registrar caught the harsh fluorescent light of the conference room gleaming like a warning beacon. Kendrick stared down at the document, his eyes darting frantically across the dense legal text, trying desperately to comprehend what new, unforeseen disaster had just been laid out before him. "Read the listed property owner aloud," Bradley instructed. His voice sliced through the heavy, suffocating silence of the locked room like a surgical scalpel. "Read the exact name of the entity that legally holds the deed to the estate you currently occupy." Kendrick swallowed incredibly hard, his throat making a dry, audible clicking sound. He leaned forward, his hands shaking as he gripped the edges of the table, his eyes narrowing as he finally found the highlighted section at the top of the page. "Q Logistics, LLC," he read. His voice was barely a whisper, trembling with a sudden, undefined terror. He looked up at me, his face twisting in desperate confusion and rising panic. "I do not understand what this means. You own the house. It is in your name. I checked the county public records myself before I submitted the application." "You checked severely outdated records," Bradley corrected sharply, leaning forward and clasping his hands tightly together on the desk. "My client officially transferred the sole legal ownership of the entire physical estate into a highly secure, registered commercial holding company long before your fraudulent reverse mortgage application ever reached the final underwriting stage. You did not place a lien against a private residential property owned by an elderly family member. You attempted to extract liquid capital by aggressively leveraging commercial real estate belonging entirely to Q Logistics, LLC. Kendrick physically recoiled in his leather chair as if he had been struck violently in the jaw. He shook his head in aggressive, frantic denial, absolutely refusing to process the lethal legal reality of his catastrophic actions. "I had the power of attorney," he stammered, his voice cracking violently as his confident facade completely crumbled. "Even if it was a corporate entity, I had his signature. I had the legal authorization to act on his behalf." Bradley let out a short, humorless laugh that held absolutely no warmth or sympathy. "A general medical and financial power of attorney designed for a private citizen does not grant you executive signing authority for a registered commercial corporation," Bradley stated, delivering each word like a physical blow to the chest. "But that is entirely irrelevant, Kendrick, because you did not actually use the power of attorney to secure that $800,000 loan. You knew the bank strictly required a direct signature from the property owner for an expedited reverse mortgage, so you sat in the guest wing of my client's house and you deliberately forged his signature on federal lending documents. You submitted a forged signature to a federally insured financial institution to extract capital from a commercial holding company." The room felt as if all the oxygen had been instantly incinerated. The immense gravity of Bradley's words hung in the air, heavy and completely inescapable. "You did not just commit standard elder financial abuse," Bradley continued, his tone absolutely relentless and punishing. "By forging a signature on a digital federal loan application transmitted across state banking lines, you committed federal wire fraud. By attempting to leverage corporate property you do not own or legally represent, you committed aggravated corporate fraud. And by presenting those falsified documents to a federally insured bank, you committed bank fraud. These are not civil family matters that can be resolved with an apology and a repayment plan. These are severe, non-negotiable federal crimes." I watched my son intimately as the true devastating magnitude of his actions finally penetrated his thick, arrogant skull. The color completely drained from Kendrick's face, turning his skin a sickly, translucent shade of chalky white. The broad-shouldered, boastful man who had strutted into the room just minutes ago entirely vanished, replaced by a hollow shell of pure, unadulterated fear. He seemed to physically shrink inside his expensive velvet dinner jacket, his posture collapsing inward as the weight of the law crushed down upon him. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, gasping for air, but no coherent sound came out. He was completely suffocating on his own sudden, inescapable reality. He finally realized he had not simply stolen from a vulnerable, aging father who might eventually take pity and forgive him. He had brazenly stolen from a registered commercial organization and actively defrauded the federal banking system. He was no longer a greedy heir fighting over an early inheritance payout. He was a cornered, white-collar criminal staring directly down the absolute destruction of his entire life. Federal wire fraud carries a massive mandatory minimum sentence, Bradley stated, hammering the final nail into the coffin with brutal clinical efficiency. When you combine the wire fraud with the aggravated corporate identity theft and the federal bank fraud, you are looking at a combined maximum penalty of over 20 years in a federal penitentiary. That is not a suspended sentence with a slap on the wrist. That is not luxurious house arrest. That is 2 decades locked inside a federal cage stripped of every single luxury, privilege, and freedom you have ever known. Kendrick's eyes rolled back slightly and he slumped forward, resting his head heavily in his trembling hands. He looked completely broken, entirely devoid of any remaining fight, arrogance, or manipulation. The grand illusion of his financial genius was entirely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The $800,000 he genuinely thought was his ultimate salvation was actually the very iron anchor that was going to drag him straight to the bottom of the ocean. He let out a low, pathetic moan that echoed miserably in the quiet, magnetically locked conference room. He was a man who had just realized he was already legally dead, merely waiting for the prison system to officially swallow him whole. I looked at him without a single ounce of paternal sympathy. He had made his choices with extreme calculated malice, and now he was going to suffer the extreme calculated consequences. While Kendrick completely mentally collapsed under the crushing weight of his impending federal prison sentence, a very different kind of chaotic panic seized his wife. Heather did not succumb to paralyzed despair or weeping regret. Her survival instinct, fueled by pure, unadulterated greed and absolute visceral terror, kicked into maximum overdrive. If the massive sum of money was officially classified as stolen federal funds, she knew the government authorities would be coming to seize it immediately. She shot up from her leather guest chair like a coiled spring, her eyes wide and manic, completely abandoning the fragile facade of the supportive, loving spouse. She dove her hand frantically into her sparkling designer evening bag and pulled out her smartphone. Her fingers trembled violently as she rapidly tapped the glowing screen, desperately opening her mobile banking application. I watched her perfectly manicured fingernails fly across the glass with aggressive urgency. She was entirely consumed by a singular, frantic, completely delusional thought. She firmly believed that if she could just access the joint account and wire the $800,000 into a private offshore holding or an untraceable cryptocurrency wallet right now, she could still salvage the stolen fortune and flee the country before the federal agents arrived. She was desperately trying to outrun a bullet that had already hit its target perfectly. Heather's thumbs struck the smooth glass screen of her smartphone with frantic bruising force. She was completely oblivious to her husband's catatonic state right beside her, entirely consumed by the desperate need to salvage their stolen fortune. All that mattered to her was the digital life raft she thought was waiting patiently in their joint checking account. I sat perfectly still in my executive chair, observing her pathetic attempt to outrun a bullet that had already pierced her chest. Her face was illuminated by the harsh blue glow of the screen as the banking application initiated its loading sequence. For a brief, agonizing second, I saw the reflection of pure, unfiltered greed shining in her wide eyes. She was mentally transferring the funds, booking the flights, and escaping the consequences. Then the glow shifted abruptly to a glaring, vibrant red. Heather gasped a sharp, choked sound of pure terror that echoed off the soundproof walls of the conference room. She tapped the screen again, much harder this time, her manicured nails clicking frantically against the glass like a trapped insect. The application did not budge. A stark, undeniable notification banner blocked her from accessing a single cent. It read, "Account frozen. Please contact the Fraud and Risk Management Department immediately." The digital vault she thought she could crack was entirely sealed shut. Her golden ticket to Monaco, her escape hatch from her massive debts, evaporated into thin air in the blink of an eye. She stared at the red error message as if it were a physical monster rising from the device. Total, unadulterated hysteria seized her instantly. "No, no, no, this cannot be happening," she shrieked, her voice cracking violently as she wildly mashed the customer service button on the screen. She pressed the phone to her ear, pacing the length of the secure conference room like a trapped rabid animal. Kendrick remained slumped in his chair, completely unresponsive, while his wife completely unraveled. The speakerphone engaged automatically, amplifying the automated ringing tone throughout the silent room. A crisp, formal voice answered on the other end. "Liberty National Bank Fraud and Risk Management Division. This call is recorded for federal compliance. How may I assist you?" Heather practically screamed into the receiver, entirely abandoning any pretense of upper-class etiquette. "My account is locked. I need it unlocked this exact second. We have a massive wire transfer to execute and your application is malfunctioning. Unlock the funds right now or I am suing this entire institution." The representative did not flinch at her aggressive tone. "Please provide your account number and identity verification," the voice requested calmly. Heather rattled off the numbers with frantic speed, her entire body shaking with toxic adrenaline. A long, agonizing pause followed. The sound of keyboard typing echoed from the phone speaker. When the representative returned, the professional courtesy had completely vanished, replaced by a cold administrative finality. "Ma'am, I am looking at your file," the representative stated flatly. "This account has been subjected to a hard administrative freeze under direct orders from the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service." Heather stopped pacing, dead in her tracks. The phone nearly slipped from her trembling fingers. "The FBI," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "What are you talking about?" "The funds deposited into this account yesterday afternoon have been officially flagged as the proceeds of a fraudulent commercial loan origination and federal wire fraud," the representative explained with brutal clarity. "The entire balance of $800,000 has been impounded pending a full federal seizure. You have absolutely zero access to these funds. We are legally prohibited from discussing this matter any further. You will need to direct all future inquiries to the federal authorities who will be contacting you shortly." The line disconnected with a sharp, undeniable click. The dial tone echoed through the conference room, sounding the absolute death knell of their fraudulent empire. Heather stood frozen, the phone still pressed to her ear, her mouth hanging open in silent, suffocating horror. The reality of their situation crashed down upon her like a collapsing building. The money was not just temporarily held, it was completely gone, seized by the most relentless federal agencies in the country. I watched the absolute devastation wash over her. Bradley leaned forward, deciding to explicitly outline the inescapable nightmare they had just created for themselves. "Let us review the precise reality of your current situation," Bradley stated, his voice a low, punishing rumble that demanded total attention. "You do not own the sprawling estate you currently occupy. You do not possess a single dime of the $46 million family inheritance. You have been entirely disinherited and erased from the Quincy Jenkins legacy. The $800,000 you fraudulently extracted from the commercial holding company has been permanently seized by the federal government as illicit criminal proceeds." Heather slowly lowered the phone, her face completely drained of color, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it bordered on madness. Bradley was not finished. However, Bradley continued, twisting the legal knife with surgical precision because Kendrick formally executed the reverse mortgage application in his own name, attempting to assume personal liability for the fraudulent commercial transaction. You still owe the bank the principal balance. The federal government seized the cash, but the bank will still aggressively hold you financially accountable for the stolen $800,000. You are entirely bankrupt. You have absolutely zero assets, zero liquid capital, and zero future prospects, but you hold nearly $1 million in toxic corporate debt. Kendrick let out another pathetic, guttural groan, burying his face deeper into his hands. The sheer magnitude of their absolute zero balance was mind-breaking. But the financial and legal ruin was only half of the punishment. I decided to deliver the final crushing blow myself. I looked directly at my son, knowing my words would pierce straight through his paralyzing despair. "And let us not forget your immediate logistical problem, Kendrick," I said smoothly, my voice cold and unyielding. The federal agents are going to take their time building an airtight prosecution case before they put you in handcuffs. But the violent men sitting in the dark gray SUV outside the front gates of my estate are not going to wait for a court date. I sent them a pristine copy of your bank statement and your flight itinerary to Monaco. They know you received a massive cash payout, and they know you were planning to flee the country without paying them the $300,000 you owe them. They are currently blockading the property. When you go back there completely empty-handed, they are not going to accept a polite apology. Kendrick's head snapped up. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with a primal, suffocating dread. You told the loan sharks, he whispered, his voice cracking with absolute terror. I did exactly what you would have done to me, I replied coldly. I secured my assets and eliminated the threat. You wanted to play a high-stakes game of survival. Welcome to the final round. The absolute inescapable trap had completely closed. They had lost the house, the inheritance, the stolen cash, their freedom, and very soon their physical safety. The crushing weight of their total comprehensive destruction finally broke the fragile toxic bond holding their marriage together. The glamorous facade of the wealthy, happy power couple shattered into a million irreparable pieces right before my eyes. Heather slowly turned her head to look at her husband. The look of panic in her eyes instantly curdled into a vicious, unadulterated hatred. The woman who had proudly paraded through my foyer holding a crystal champagne flute just an hour ago was entirely gone. In her place stood a cornered, desperate predator realizing she was shackled to a sinking corpse. She did not reach out to comfort him. She did not offer a word of unified support. The survival instinct overrode every single vow they had ever made to each other. The toxic foundation of their relationship, built entirely on greed, entitlement, and stolen wealth, violently collapsed under the pressure of imminent prison time and mob retaliation. She took a deliberate step toward Kendrick, her hands balled into tight, shaking fists, her chest heaving with explosive, uncontrollable rage. The beautiful, unified front they presented to the world was dead, leaving only two cornered animals ready to tear each other apart to survive. A shrill, ear-piercing scream erupted from Heather's throat, shattering the suffocating silence of the locked conference room. It was not a cry of sorrow, but a raw, animalistic howl of a woman watching her luxurious, unearned future disintegrate into absolute nothingness. The sound bounced violently off the acoustic panels, vibrating in the air with toxic, unfiltered desperation. She clawed at her own perfectly styled blonde hair, her manicured nails digging into her scalp as the sheer magnitude of their comprehensive destruction fully registered in her brain. She looked like a cornered predator, realizing that the trap was not just sprung, but forged from impenetrable steel. The glamorous, entitled socialite who had paraded around my estate sipping vintage champagne just an hour ago had vanished completely. In her place stood a frantic, hyperventilating shell, her chest heaving as she spun away from the locked door and turned her vicious, bloodshot eyes toward the man she had promised to love and honor. The marital solidarity they had used to bully me, the united front of fake concern and shared greed, snapped like a dry, brittle twig under the crushing weight of impending federal prison sentences. Heather lunged forward, closing the distance between herself and her husband in 2 aggressive strides. "You absolute incompetent failure," she shrieked, her voice cracking with raw, unadulterated venom. She shoved Kendrick hard in the chest, forcing him deeper into his leather chair. "You told me you had this entirely under control. You told me the power of attorney was bulletproof. You guaranteed me that we would be on a flight to Monaco by Sunday. Instead, you forged federal documents like a desperate amateur street thug and dragged me directly into a massive federal investigation. You ruined my entire life." Kendrick raised his hands defensively, trying to shield himself from her physical and verbal assault, but his spirit was already broken. "Heather, please," he stammered, his voice weak and pathetic. "We did this together. It was your idea to speed up the timeline. It was your idea to put him in the state medical facility. Do not try to pin this entirely on me." Heather did not care about the truth or shared culpability. The arrogant, superior demeanor she had worn like a crown since the day I met her completely dissolved. Survival was her only remaining instinct. She spun around her expensive sequined dress, catching the harsh fluorescent light, and threw herself onto the carpeted floor directly in front of my chair. She collapsed onto her knees, pressing her hands together in a desperate theatrical plea for mercy. "Quincy, please listen to me," she begged, tears of pure terror streaming down her face, ruining her meticulous makeup. I had absolutely nothing to do with the forgery. I did not know he signed your name to that commercial mortgage application. He lied to me just like he lied to you. He manipulated my trust. You know I always cared about you. I was just trying to help manage the household. You cannot let them send me to federal prison or let those violent men come after me. I am entirely innocent. Please, Quincy, I will do anything you ask. I will testify against him in federal court. I will sign a full sworn confession detailing his entire scheme. Just protect me. Please. I looked down at her tear-stained face, feeling absolutely nothing but profound disgust. This was the same woman who had mocked my late wife, who had actively plotted to strip away my human dignity, and who had gleefully celebrated my forced medical removal. Now faced with the brutal consequences of her own boundless greed, she was eagerly offering her husband up as a sacrificial lamb just to save her own skin. She was an absolute parasite, entirely devoid of loyalty, honor, or basic human decency. I did not offer her a hand. I did not offer a single word of comfort or forgiveness. I simply stared at her with the cold, unyielding detachment of a judge viewing a convicted criminal. The sound of Heather eagerly volunteering to serve as a federal witness against her own husband was the final catalyst that completely shattered Kendrick's paralyzed stupor. The humiliation of being thoroughly outsmarted by his father was one thing, but watching his wife desperately throw him under the bus to save herself ignited a sudden explosive fury deep within his core. The paralyzing fear instantly mutated into a violent, uncontrolled rage. Kendrick shot up from his leather chair, his face contorted into an ugly mask of pure betrayal and wrath. "Shut your lying mouth!" he roared, his voice echoing fiercely through the secure room. "You greedy, manipulative witch! You pushed me into this! You demanded the luxury cars, you demanded the estate, you stood in the hallway and explicitly told me to use the power of attorney today before he revoked it. You are just as guilty as I am." Heather scrambled to her feet, matching his fury with her own toxic desperation. "I did not tell you to commit a federal felony, you absolute idiot!" she screamed right back, stepping aggressively into his personal space. "You are a massive failure. You could not even steal from a senile old man correctly." The violent tension finally reached its inevitable boiling point. Kendrick raised his right arm, his hand balled into a tight fist, and then suddenly uncurled his fingers. With a sharp, aggressive pivot of his hips, he swung his open palm with maximum force. The loud, stinging crack of skin striking skin reverberated through the conference room like a gunshot. The heavy slap caught Heather squarely on the left side of her face. The sheer force of the impact spun her violently around. She lost her footing in her designer heels and crashed heavily into the edge of the obsidian conference table before crumbling unceremoniously to the carpeted floor. She let out a sharp, breathless gasp, pressing a trembling hand against her rapidly reddening cheek. For a split second, the room was dead silent. Then, Heather unleashed a feral, guttural scream and lunged straight at his legs, pulling him down to the floor with her. The polished upper-class facade completely disintegrated. They were no longer a sophisticated corporate couple. They were two cornered, desperate animals tearing each other apart inside a steel cage. They rolled on the floor, shouting vicious insults, grabbing at clothing, and exchanging frantic, uncoordinated blows. The beautiful sequined dress tore at the seams. The tailored velvet dinner jacket ripped violently at the shoulder. I sat perfectly still in my executive chair, my posture relaxed and completely unbothered by the chaos unfolding mere feet away from me. I reached out, picked up the glass of chilled, sparkling water Bradley had poured for me earlier, and took a slow, deliberate sip. I crossed my legs, resting my hands comfortably on my lap. I watched the pathetic, humiliating spectacle with absolute chilling satisfaction. I did not raise my voice to stop them. I did not ask Bradley to intervene or call for building security. I simply let them destroy each other. It was a fitting, deeply poetic physical conclusion to their treacherous, deceitful partnership. They had built a marriage on a foundation of entitlement and stolen wealth, and now that foundation had completely collapsed, leaving nothing but resentment and visceral hatred in its wake. The humiliating physical altercation on the floor of the conference room continued to escalate, a pathetic display of mutually assured destruction. Heather shrieked, scratching wildly at Kendrick's face, while he desperately tried to pin her arms to the carpet, shouting breathless, toxic curses. They were entirely consumed by their own vicious implosion, completely oblivious to the world outside the locked mahogany doors. But the brutal reality of their situation was about to crash through the walls with undeniable authoritative force. A high-pitched, piercing wail suddenly cut through the heavy soundproofing of the executive suite. It was faint at first, a distant hum bouncing off the towering glass skyscrapers of the downtown financial district. But within seconds, the sound multiplied and rapidly intensified, growing into a deafening, overlapping chorus of emergency sirens. The frantic scrambling on the floor abruptly ceased. Kendrick and Heather froze, their torn clothes and bruised faces reflecting pure, unfiltered terror as the mechanical screams echoed aggressively through the night air. The heavy flashing red and blue lights of multiple emergency vehicles reflected off the adjacent glass buildings, illuminating the conference room windows with a harsh, rhythmic strobe effect. The deafening sirens did not pass by the building. They converged rapidly, the screeching tires echoing loudly as several heavy police cruisers and unmarked federal vehicles aggressively jumped the curb and slammed into park directly in the plaza right below the law office. The authorities had officially arrived to collect their prize. The heavy magnetic lock on the conference room door did not just disengage quietly. It was violently and aggressively bypassed. The thick mahogany double doors burst open with a deafening crash, striking the interior walls so hard the acoustic paneling visibly shuddered. A tidal wave of dark tactical gear, heavy utility belts, and glaring flashlights flooded into the executive suite. 4 heavily armed local police officers stormed in first, quickly fanning out to secure the perimeter of the room and block any potential avenues of escape. Right behind them strode 2 senior agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, their gold badges prominently displayed over their sharp, dark suits. The chaotic, pathetic brawl happening on the carpeted floor instantly evaporated. The overwhelming, undeniable presence of absolute law enforcement paralyzed the room completely. Heather froze with her hands still violently tangled in her husband's torn velvet jacket, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. Kendrick went completely rigid, his breath catching in his throat as the harsh beams of tactical flashlights pinned them both to the floor like trapped rodents. The flashing red and blue lights from the plaza below cast long, dancing shadows across the ceiling. The time for running, negotiating, and manipulating was officially and permanently over. "Get on the ground and keep your hands exactly where we can see them." A towering police officer barked, his voice echoing with absolute, uncompromising authority. Kendrick and Heather were roughly hauled to their feet by the officers, their torn and disheveled clothing hanging off them in a stark display of their ruined status. The metallic, unforgiving ratcheting of heavy steel handcuffs instantly filled the room. The sharp clicks sounded final and absolute. Heather shrieked as her arms were forcibly twisted behind her back, her expensive sequined dress tearing further under the harsh clinical grip of the arresting officer. She thrashed wildly, screaming that she was a victim, that she had absolutely no knowledge of the commercial fraud, and that she was being unlawfully detained. But her desperate protests fell on completely deaf ears. The agents already had the digital trail of her attempting to access the frozen, stolen funds just minutes prior. She was being formally charged as a willing, active accomplice to federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. Kendrick did not fight back. The fight had been entirely drained out of his body the moment the sirens started wailing outside the building. As the cold steel cuffs locked tightly around his wrists, his knees buckled beneath him. The arresting officers tried to hold him upright by his arms, but his legs turned to absolute jelly. He collapsed heavily onto the carpeted floor, landing on his knees right in front of the massive obsidian conference table. The arrogant, high-rolling financial executive who had paraded around my estate sipping vintage champagne was totally gone. In his place was a terrified, broken shell of a man weeping uncontrollably. Tears and saliva streamed down his face in gross, uninterrupted lines, ruining his meticulously groomed appearance. He looked up at me from the floor, his chest heaving with violent, pathetic sobs that shook his entire frame. "Dad, please," Kendrick wailed, his voice cracking with a desperate, guttural agony. It was the very first time in months he had uttered that word with anything remotely resembling genuine emotion or respect. "Dad, you have to stop them. You have to tell them this is a massive misunderstanding. Tell them we had a private family agreement. I will give it all back. I will sign whatever you want me to sign. Please do not let them take me to federal prison. I will not survive in there. You are my father. You cannot do this to your own flesh and blood. Please, Dad, I am begging you. Save me." He dragged his knees forward across the carpet, straining aggressively against the heavy grip of the police officer holding him back by the collar of his ruined velvet jacket. He was a miserable, desperate sight, perfectly willing to trade every last ounce of his dignity for a single shred of mercy. He was hoping to exploit the paternal bond he had spent the last year actively trying to exploit and destroy. He genuinely thought my biological connection to him would ultimately override the magnitude of his unforgivable betrayal. I did not flinch. I did not blink. I sat in my high-backed leather executive chair and watched him grovel on the floor with total, absolute emotional detachment. The man weeping on the carpet was a complete stranger to me. The son I had raised, the boy I had sacrificed my youth to provide for, had died the exact moment he decided my life, my legacy, and my freedom were nothing more than disposable obstacles to his personal wealth. I placed my hands flat on the polished stone table and slowly pushed myself up. I stood to my full height, towering over the pathetic scene unfolding in the room. With slow, deliberate, and meticulous precision, I reached down and fastened the center button of my bespoke charcoal vest. I adjusted my cuffs, ensuring my silver links were perfectly aligned and unbothered. My composure was an impenetrable fortress of ice, a stark, punishing contrast to the chaotic, sweaty despair radiating from my son and his wife. I walked slowly around the edge of the massive obsidian table. The heavy, measured steps of my leather shoes silenced Kendrick's blubbering pleas, forcing him to hold his breath in terrified anticipation. I stopped exactly 2 feet away from him. He craned his neck upward, his bloodshot, tear-filled eyes searching my face frantically for any sign of hesitation, any flicker of paternal warmth, any small crack in my armor that he could exploit. He found absolutely nothing. He was staring directly into a deep, endless void of accountability. "You made a critical, fatal miscalculation, Kendrick," I stated. My voice was low, smooth, and projected with a lethal, terrifying calmness that made even the federal agents in the room stand perfectly still. "You assumed that my love for you was an unconditional blank check. You thought you could strip me of my dignity, throw me into a decaying state medical ward, and steal the legacy I built with your mother from the ground up, all while expecting me to catch you when you inevitably fell. You viewed my kindness, my patience, and my age as a terminal weakness you could harvest for cash." I leaned down slightly, bringing my face closer to his, ensuring that my final words would be permanently burned into his memory and echo in his mind for the next 2 decades. I looked directly into his terrified, weeping eyes, letting him see the absolute finality of my decision. "I use my wealth to save human beings." I whispered, my words sharp, pristine, and carrying the finality of a heavy guillotine blade dropping. "I do not use it to feed starving animals." The words hit him with devastating physical force. The last tiny ember of hope in his eyes was instantly extinguished, replaced by a hollow, profound realization that he was entirely and permanently doomed. He gasped for air, his jaw dropping open, completely destroyed by the sheer, unyielding coldness of my sentence. His shoulders slumped forward, his chin hitting his chest, as the reality of a 20-year federal prison sentence finally crushed the last remaining breath out of his lungs. I did not wait for a response. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to negotiate, and absolutely nothing left to mourn. I straightened my posture, turned my back on the pathetic creature kneeling on the floor, and walked purposefully toward the exit. Bradley stepped aside, holding the heavy mahogany door open for me with a nod of deep, solemn professional respect. As I crossed the threshold into the quiet, dimly lit hallway, the conference room erupted behind me. Kendrick unleashed a visceral, agonizing scream of pure defeat while Heather began shouting frantic, toxic curses at the federal agents, forcibly dragging her toward the freight elevators. I did not break my stride. I did not slow down, and I absolutely did not look back. Their desperate, echoing screams faded into irrelevant background noise the further I walked down the long corridor. I stepped into the private executive elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor. The heavy steel doors slid shut instantly, cutting off the sound of their destruction entirely. I descended into the cool, crisp night air of the city, breathing freely and deeply for the first time in what felt like an absolute eternity. The cancerous tumor had been completely and surgically excised, and my real, unburdened life was finally ready to begin. The sharp, resounding crack of the judge's heavy wooden gavel echoed like a cannon shot through the cavernous federal courtroom, signaling the absolute, undeniable end of a grueling 6-month legal nightmare. It was a crisp Tuesday morning in late October. The air in the room was sterile, heavily burdened by the crushing weight of finalized justice. I sat in the front row of the polished oak gallery, flanked closely by Bradley Hayes and my private security detail. I wore a bespoke, tailored navy blue suit, my posture perfectly straight, my expression an impenetrable fortress of calm, clinical observation. Across the wide center aisle, the defense table presented a pathetic, deeply satisfying portrait of absolute ruin. The grand illusions of corporate mastery and high society entitlement had been systematically dismantled, shredded into fine dust by the relentless, unforgiving machinery of the federal judicial system. There were no arrogant smirks today. There was no fake, sugary Southern charm. There was only the bleak, terrifying reality of the brutal consequences they had so arrogantly courted. The federal judge, a stern, no-nonsense woman with absolutely zero tolerance for white-collar predators who targeted the elderly, looked down from her elevated bench with a gaze that could freeze boiling water. She adjusted her reading glasses, her voice echoing with lethal authority, and delivered the final, inescapable verdict. Kendrick Jenkins, for the undeniable premeditated crimes of federal wire fraud, aggravated corporate identity theft, and massive bank fraud, you are hereby sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, strictly without the possibility of early parole. The words dropped onto the defense table like heavy iron anvils. Kendrick did not cry out. He did not protest. He simply collapsed inward, his broad shoulders slouching in total defeat as the armed bailiffs immediately moved in to securely chain his wrists to his waist. He had been stripped of his custom-tailored velvet jackets and designer watches, forced instead into a harsh, degrading neon orange prison jumpsuit. He would spend the next decade and a half locked inside a violent, unforgiving concrete box, entirely erased from the luxurious world he had tried so desperately to steal. I watched him being forcefully escorted out the heavy side door, shuffling his feet, a broken, defeated phantom heading straight into the dark abyss of the federal prison system. I watched my own son walk away in chains, and I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, satisfying sense of closure. Heather's fate was an entirely different, highly specialized brand of poetic justice. She narrowly avoided a federal prison cell by aggressively turning state's evidence, testifying against her husband in agonizing, humiliating detail during the discovery phase. But her treacherous betrayal did not buy her salvation or a fresh start. It only bought her a lifetime of crushing, inescapable poverty and public disgrace. The federal judge handed her 5 years of strict, heavily supervised probation. More importantly, the civil courts and the violently angry loan sharks completely decimated her entire life. Because her signature and name were directly tied to the fraudulent joint accounts and the subsequent legal fallout, every single asset she possessed was aggressively seized and rapidly liquidated. Her designer wardrobe, her expensive diamond jewelry, her luxury vehicles, and her high-end accessories were all auctioned off by the state to pay the massive restitution she still legally owed the bank. She was forcefully evicted from her high society circles, shunned and blocked by every affluent friend who had eagerly attended her fake victory party. Today, Heather resides in a cramped, decaying, roach-infested studio apartment in one of the most dangerous, impoverished industrial sectors of the city. Stripped of her stolen wealth and fake prestige, she was forced to take a grueling minimum-wage job as a nighttime janitor at a local rundown commercial bus station. She spends her long, agonizing nights scrubbing filthy public toilets and mopping sticky, urine-stained linoleum floors. Her perfectly manicured hands are now calloused, cracked, and ruined by harsh industrial chemicals. She works endless bone-crushing shifts just to barely survive the staggering mountain of toxic debt she carries permanently on her shoulders. Her absolute punishment was complete, total, and irreversible. Later that evening, I stood alone on the expansive marble balcony of my master suite. The cool, crisp autumn wind blew gently across the sprawling, meticulously manicured grounds of my estate. The house was finally entirely quiet. It was not the tense, suffocating silence of waiting for a hostile ambush or listening to whispers behind closed doors. It was the pure, unadulterated tranquility of absolute security and total ownership. The guest wing had been thoroughly and aggressively gutted. The very next day after their arrests, I hired a specialized industrial cleaning crew to strip out every piece of furniture, every carpet, and every single lingering trace of Kendrick and Heather's toxic existence. The walls were scrubbed bare to the studs and repainted in vibrant, welcoming colors. The foul stench of their greed, their fake designer perfumes, and their malicious entitlement had been completely and surgically eradicated from my property. The estate was fully cleansed, restored to the beautiful, peaceful sanctuary that Lorraine and I had originally envisioned when we laid the very first bricks. I did not just reclaim my physical home. I aggressively executed the grand philanthropic vision I had kept completely hidden from their greedy eyes. The Lorraine Jenkins Philanthropic Foundation was officially fully funded and operating at maximum capacity. Over the past 6 months, I had personally overseen the direct transfer of millions of dollars into the heart of the community. We broke ground on a massive state-of-the-art youth recreation and technology center right in the middle of the downtown neighborhood where Lorraine and I grew up with nothing. We funded 50 full-ride comprehensive university scholarships for brilliant underprivileged black students who just needed a fair fighting chance to succeed in a world stacked against them. We actively revitalized 3 community churches, providing them with the necessary capital to massively expand their food pantries and local housing initiatives for the homeless. Every single dollar that Kendrick and Heather had callously plotted to steal to fund luxury cars, Mediterranean yacht vacations, and superficial status symbols was instead actively changing lives, building futures, and cementing a legacy of genuine, tangible empowerment. I was not hoarding my hard-earned wealth in a dark, silent vault. I was deploying it as an unstoppable, aggressive force for good, operating with the total, unburdened freedom of a man who answers to absolutely no one but his own conscience. I raised a heavy crystal tumbler to my lips and took a slow, measured sip of the 20-year-old bourbon. The smooth, oaky burn warmed my chest, settling perfectly into the quiet evening air. I rested my hands on the cool marble railing and looked out over the rolling silhouette of the distant tree line against the darkening, star-filled sky. People often ask me through whispered community gossip or indirect cautious questions from well-meaning corporate attorneys if I feel any lingering sorrow. They wonder if a father's heart naturally grieves the total, unrecoverable destruction and incarceration of his only biological son. I search my conscience deeply for even a microscopic fraction of regret, and I find absolutely none. I feel no guilt. I feel no remorse. I shed no tears for the boy I once knew because that boy chose to become a monster. I feel only the profound clinical relief of a man who has successfully and permanently excised a necrotic, life-threatening tumor from his own body before it could poison his heart. Kendrick and Heather chose to operate in the shadows, arrogantly believing their lies were a flawless armor against a tired, trusting old man. They vastly underestimated the sheer, terrifying power of a man who has nothing left to lose and everything to protect. They tried to bury me alive in the dark, completely forgetting that I was the very man who built the light. The game is permanently over, the board is entirely cleared, and the undeniable punishing power of the truth always claims the final absolute victory. If this ordeal has taught me one final truth, it is that blood is never an acceptable substitute for character. Society often conditions us to believe that aging equates to inherent weakness, that gray hair somehow dulls a sharp mind. Kendrick and Heather weaponized my age, assuming my quiet demeanor was a symptom of surrender rather than the calculated patience of a seasoned businessman. They learned too late that true power never needs to scream for attention. It sits quietly, observes the fatal flaws in its enemies, and waits for the exact right moment to strike. Never let anyone confuse your peaceful twilight years for defenselessness. If you agree that respect must be earned regardless of family ties, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own stories of setting unbreakable boundaries in the comments below.